Have you ever heard of a pilot so skilled that enemies refused to believe the reports? A warrior whose very existence challenged everything the military establishment thought they knew about courage, capability, and the art of aerial combat? This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Redfeather, a Lakota woman who became one of the most decorated and controversial pilots of an alternate World War II. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. The military tried to bury it. Historians debated it. But the evidence, hidden in classified files for 70 years, tells a story that defies belief. Spring 1943. The war in the Atlantic had reached a turning point. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, but a new threat had emerged. One that Allied command had not anticipated. A rogue Polish naval contingent, influenced by extremist elements and armed with captured German vessels, had begun attacking American supply convoys bound for Britain. The reasons remain murky to this day, lost in the fog of wartime chaos and political intrigue. What matters is this: American ships were sinking, and someone had to stop them. The Army Air Corps faced a crisis. Their best pilots were deployed in Europe and the Pacific. Training new crews took months. Losses were mounting. Then, from an unlikely corner of Montana, came a name that would change everything. Sarah Redfeather had learned to fly at 16, barnstorming across the Dakotas with her father, a veteran of the Great War who had been denied entry to the Army Air Service because of his heritage. He taught his daughter everything he knew about aircraft, about reading the wind, about becoming one with the machine. By 1942, she could fly anything with wings. When the Women Air Force Service Pilots program began, Sarah was among the first to volunteer. She excelled in every test, outperforming men who had twice her flight hours. But there was resistance. Officers whispered that she was too small, too inexperienced, too female, too Indian. They found every excuse to keep her in transport duty, ferrying trainers from factory to base. She had never touched a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The twin-engine medium bomber was a beast, over 50 feet long, weighing 19,000 pounds empty, capable of carrying 3,000 pounds of bombs. It required strength, precision, and nerves of steel. Military doctrine said women weren't physically capable of handling such aircraft in combat conditions. Native women, some officers muttered, even less so. But war has a way of breaking rules when necessity demands it. Captain James Morrison was a bomber squadron commander stationed at Naval Air Station Norfolk. He had lost 3 crews in 2 weeks to the rogue Polish ships, which operated with shocking coordination and firepower. His superiors demanded results. His men were exhausted, traumatized, angry. He needed a miracle. The miracle arrived on a cold March morning in the form of a 5'4" Lakota woman with braided black hair and eyes that had seen too much prairie sky to fear anything man-made. Sarah had been ferrying a B-25 from the factory in Kansas City to Norfolk when she overheard radio chatter about the Polish threat. She landed, walked into Morrison's office without an appointment, and said 7 words that would echo through military history. "Give me a bomber, and I'll end this." Morrison's first instinct was to laugh. His second was to have her removed. His third, born of desperation and a flash of intuition, was to listen. She laid out a plan with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life proving doubters wrong. The Polish ships operated in wolf packs, she explained, coordinating their movements to maximize defensive coverage. Standard bombing runs came in high and level, giving anti-aircraft gunners plenty of time to track and fire. The attacks were predictable, and the ships had learned to exploit that predictability. Sarah proposed something different, something dangerous, something that required a kind of flying that barely qualified as sane. She would go in alone, at wave-top level, using the ocean itself as cover. She would come at them from the direction of the rising sun, using the glare to mask her approach. And she would strike not with precision bombing, but with skip bombing, a technique so risky that even experienced pilots avoided it. The bomber would skim 15 feet above the water at full speed, release bombs that would skip across the surface like stones on a pond, and strike the ships below the waterline, where armor was weakest. Morrison studied her for a long moment. He saw in her eyes something he recognized from his own reflection after too many missions, too many lost friends. Determination that bordered on fury, skill that demanded to be tested, and something else, something harder to define, a kind of ancestral certainty, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this is suicide." "You understand," she replied, "that I'm going anyway." He gave her the bomber. The crew was another matter. No one wanted to fly with her. The bombardier assigned to her plane requested a transfer. The navigator claimed illness. The gunners made excuses. In the end, she went up with a skeleton crew, a young radio man named Tommy Chen, fresh from training, who hadn't been around long enough to absorb the base's prejudices, and a veteran tail gunner named Marcus Webb, who figured he was going to die anyway and might as well go out with a good story. They launched before dawn on March 23, 1943. Intelligence had located a Polish wolf pack operating 200 miles east of the Virginia coast. 5 destroyers, moving in formation, hunting for convoys. Sarah pushed the B-25 low, so low that spray from the waves kissed the bomber's belly. Tommy Chen's voice crackled over the intercom, nervous, asking if they should gain altitude. She didn't answer. Her focus was absolute. She had entered a state her father had taught her about, a place where thought dissolved and instinct took over. The Lakota called it being in harmony with the spirit of the hunt. The sun rose ahead of them, painting the ocean gold and crimson. Sarah adjusted her course, positioning the bomber so that anyone looking west would be staring directly into the blinding light. The Polish ships never saw them coming. The first destroyer appeared as a dark shape against the morning glare. Sarah's hand moved on the controls with fluid precision. The bomber dropped even lower, skimming so close to the water that Marcus Webb, in the tail, could see individual waves. At 300 yards, traveling at 230 miles per hour, she released the first bomb. It left the bay, struck the water at a shallow angle, and skipped. Once, twice, 3 times. Then it slammed into the destroyer's hull below the waterline and detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. Water and steel erupted skyward. The ship listed immediately, taking on water through a hole the size of a truck. Sarah didn't wait to watch it sink. She was already banking hard, coming around for the second pass. The Polish crews were scrambling now, anti-aircraft guns swiveling, trying to track a target that moved like a hawk hunting rabbits. But Sarah was inside their defensive envelope, too low and too fast for the guns to depress far enough. She made pass after pass, each one perfect, each bomb finding its mark. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, 3 destroyers were sinking and 2 more were dead in the water, listing badly, their crews abandoning ship. Sarah pulled the bomber up, gained altitude, and turned for home. The entire engagement had lasted 17 minutes. Tommy Chen's voice over the intercom was shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. Did that really happen? Marcus Webb, who had flown 37 missions over Germany, who had seen things that gave him nightmares, who thought nothing could surprise him anymore, simply said, Holy hell. Back at Norfolk, Morrison was on the radio with Atlantic Command, trying to explain what his patrol aircraft were reporting. 5 Polish ships destroyed or disabled. 1 B-25 bomber. 1 pilot. No losses. That's impossible, the admiral said. Yes, sir, Morrison replied. I thought so too. When Sarah landed, there was a crowd waiting on the tarmac. Word had spread. Men who had refused to fly with her now stood in silence as she climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with sweat, her hands still steady on the ladder. Morrison approached, his face unreadable. For a moment, Sarah wondered if he was angry, if she had somehow violated protocol, if the success was going to be twisted into a reprimand because she hadn't followed procedure. Then he saluted her, crisply, formally, with genuine respect. Lieutenant Redfeather, he said, you just became the most dangerous pilot in the Atlantic. She saluted back. Sir, respectfully, I was always the most dangerous pilot in the Atlantic. You just didn't know it yet. A few men laughed. A few more joined in. And just like that, the ice broke. But this was only the beginning. The Polish rogue fleet, it turned out, was larger than intelligence had estimated. The 5 ships Sarah destroyed were just one wolf pack. There were others. And now they knew she was hunting them. The next mission came 36 hours later. The Polish ships had changed tactics, traveling in tighter formations, increasing their anti-aircraft coverage, posting lookouts with specific instructions to watch for low-altitude approaches from the east at dawn. They had studied her. Now she had to adapt. Sarah requested a night mission. Morrison hesitated. Night flying in a B-25 over the open ocean, without modern navigation equipment, was dangerous even for the most experienced crews. For a pilot on her 3rd combat sortie, it was borderline reckless. They're expecting me at dawn, Sarah said, so I'll come at midnight. She went up with a full crew this time. Volunteers. Men who had seen what she could do and wanted to be part of history. The bombardier, a tough Texan named Bill Rourke, told her, I don't care what anyone says. You're the real deal. The mission was everything Morrison feared, and more. Cloud cover obscured the stars. Rain battered the windscreen. Navigation was a nightmare of dead reckoning and prayer. But Sarah flew as if she could see in the dark, as if the night was her natural element. They found the Polish ships by following the sound of their engines, a low rumble that carried across the water. Sarah killed her own engines, gliding in silent, a predator in the darkness. The bombs fell without warning. The first ship exploded before its crew even knew they were under attack. The second ship fired blindly into the darkness, tracers arcing uselessly into empty sky, while Sarah circled back, lined up another approach, and struck again. The third ship tried to run, pushing its engines to maximum, but it couldn't outrun fate. By the time the sun rose, 3 more Polish ships had joined their sisters at the bottom of the Atlantic. Sarah landed with her fuel gauge reading empty, the engines coughing as she touched down. 8 ships in 2 days. 15 enemy vessels destroyed in less than 48 hours. The military establishment didn't know what to do with her. She was a propaganda dream and a political nightmare. Promoting her meant admitting that they had been wrong about women in combat, wrong about Native Americans in leadership roles, wrong about who could be a warrior. Ignoring her meant looking foolish in the face of undeniable success. Compromise came in the form of a medal ceremony with no press coverage and a promotion that came with an asterisk. Lieutenant Redfeather was decorated for valor, then quietly reassigned to training duty. She was too dangerous to use and too valuable to waste, so they put her in limbo. But Sarah Redfeather had tasted combat and found something there that satisfied a hunger she hadn't known she carried. The sky had always been her home, but now she understood that some people were born to fight in it, to dance with death at 200 miles per hour, to prove that courage had no gender and skill had no color. The war would need her again, sooner than anyone expected, and when it did, she would be ready. Because the Polish rogue fleet had been destroyed? Yes, but the forces that created it, the shadowy networks of extremists and opportunists who saw the war as a chance to settle old scores and seize power, those forces were still out there, growing, planning, and they had learned her name. The medals sat in a drawer in Sarah's quarters at Randolph Field, Texas, where they had transferred her to train new pilots. Bronze Star, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. She never wore them. They felt like apologies disguised as honors, compensation for being removed from the fight she had proven she could win. Training duty was a special kind of torture for someone who had tasted real combat. Day after day, she took nervous cadets up in training aircraft, teaching them basic maneuvers they should have learned months earlier. Some were talented, most were mediocre. A few were dangerous to themselves and others. None of them understood what war really meant, what it felt like to see a ship explode beneath your wings, to know that men were dying because of decisions you made in fractions of seconds. The other instructors treated her with careful politeness that somehow felt worse than open hostility. They called her Lieutenant Redfeather, asked her technical questions, deferred to her expertise on skip bombing techniques, but they never invited her to the officers' club, never included her in their card games, never asked about her missions. She existed in a bubble of respectful isolation, acknowledged but never accepted. Tommy Chen, her radio man from those 2 legendary days, wrote her letters from his new posting in North Africa. His handwriting was terrible, his grammar worse, but his loyalty was absolute. "They talk about you here," he wrote in one letter. "Some guys don't believe it really happened. I show them the mission reports. I tell them I was there. They still don't believe it. How can someone do something so impossible that even the witnesses doubt their own memories?" Marcus Webb, the tail gunner, had been less fortunate. He had flown 3 more missions with other crews before his bomber went down over the North Atlantic. He survived the crash, spent 18 hours in a life raft, and was picked up by a destroyer. The cold water had destroyed his lungs. He was medically discharged, sent home to Alabama with a Purple Heart and a cough that would kill him before his 40th birthday. Sarah received a letter from his sister, thanking her for giving Marcus the best day of his life. The letter made her cry, which she almost never did. Captain Morrison, promoted to major and given command of a bomber wing in England, sent her tactical manuals and reports from the European theater. No personal messages, just professional correspondence, as if they were colleagues debating aircraft specifications. But Sarah understood what he was really saying. "I haven't forgotten. You belong in this war. I'm trying to bring you back." Months passed. Summer turned to fall. 1943 became 1944. The war ground on, consuming young men by the thousands. Sarah taught cadets, filed reports, and felt a part of herself dying from disuse. Then, in February of 1944, everything changed. The call came at 0300 hours, jarring her from dreams of flight. Colonel Richard Hawthorne's voice on the phone was clipped, urgent, stripped of the usual military formality. "Lieutenant Redfeather, you're needed in Washington immediately. A car will arrive in 20 minutes. Pack for an extended deployment. Tell no one where you're going." "Sir, what's this about?" "Not on this line. Be ready." The car was a black Packard sedan with government plates, and a driver who spoke not a single word during the 8-hour journey to the capital. They drove through the night and into the gray dawn, passing through 3 military checkpoints, each guard examining credentials with increasing scrutiny. Sarah tried to sleep but couldn't. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. They arrived at the Pentagon just after noon. The building was less than 2 years old, already a monument to American military might and bureaucratic expansion. The driver led her through corridors that seemed to multiply like a maze, past offices with closed doors, and serious-looking men carrying folders marked Top Secret. Finally, they reached a conference room in the building's interior, a windowless space with maps covering every wall. 7 men waited inside. She recognized 2. Major Morrison, looking older and graver than she remembered, and Colonel Hawthorne, a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who had spent too many years making impossible decisions. The others were strangers, high-ranking officers whose insignia indicated positions far above her pay grade. A 2-star general sat at the head of the table, his face weathered and hard. "Lieutenant Redfeather," the general said without preamble, "I'm General Thomas Bradford, Office of Strategic Services. We have a situation that requires your particular talents. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest level. Disclosure would be considered treason. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir. The Polish ships you destroyed last year were not the rogue operation we initially believed. They were part of a larger network, one that extends far beyond military targets. We've been tracking this organization for months. They call themselves the Black Sun Pact, a coalition of extremist elements from several nations who believe the Allied powers are fighting the wrong enemy. They want to prolong the war, create chaos, and seize power in the resulting vacuum." He nodded to an aide, who dimmed the lights and activated a projector. Images appeared on a screen. Grainy photographs of men in dark uniforms, documents covered in cryptic symbols, maps with red circles marking locations across the Atlantic seaboard. "3 weeks ago," Bradford continued, "we intercepted communications indicating that the Pact has acquired something that could change the entire course of the war, a weapon. We don't know the details yet, but our intelligence suggests it's chemical or biological in nature, possibly derived from captured German research. They plan to deploy it against an American city. We don't know which city, and we don't know when, but the time frame is measured in weeks, not months." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. "Where do I fit into this, sir?" "The Pact's leadership operates from a converted merchant vessel, the Falkenhorst, currently hiding somewhere in the North Atlantic. Standard naval operations can't find it. They're using weather patterns, submarine escorts, and extraordinary operational security. Every time we get close, they vanish. We've lost 2 destroyers trying to hunt them down. We need someone who can operate independently, who can find them, engage them, and destroy that weapon before they can deploy it. You want me to sink a ship that the entire Atlantic Fleet can't locate? No, Lieutenant. We want you to do something much harder." Another aide stepped forward, placing a new folder on the table in front of her. Sarah opened it. The documents inside detailed a modified B-25, redesigned for extreme long-range operations, extra fuel tanks, advanced radio equipment, modified bomb bay capable of carrying specialized munitions, and something else, provisions for a crew of 7 instead of the usual 6. "We've assembled a team," Morrison said, speaking for the first time. "The best people I could find. People who understand what you can do and want to fly with you. But this won't be like the missions off Norfolk. You'll be operating 400 miles from land, in winter weather, with no backup and no rescue if something goes wrong. The odds of coming back are not good." Sarah studied the file, her mind already working through the tactical challenges. Finding one ship in thousands of square miles of ocean, identifying it correctly without air-to-ground communication, destroying not just the vessel, but the weapon aboard, which meant precision strikes, not area bombardment. Doing all of this while under fire from what the intelligence report suggested was a heavily armed target with experimental anti-aircraft systems. "Who's on the crew?" she asked. Morrison slid another file across the table. Sarah opened it and saw faces she knew. Tommy Chen recovered from a minor wound and volunteered the instant he heard she was flying again. A bombardier named Susan Park, one of the handful of Asian American women in military service who had scored perfect marks in every training exercise. A navigator, Lieutenant James Blackwood, Navajo, with a gift for dead reckoning that bordered on supernatural. 2 gunners, both combat veterans from the Pacific Theater. And a flight engineer, a grizzled warrant officer named Frank Kowalski, who had kept bombers flying through mechanical nightmares that should have been fatal. "They all volunteered?" Sarah asked. "They fought for the assignment," Morrison said quietly. "Blackwood threatened to go AWOL if we didn't put him on your crew." Park said, and I quote, "I'm tired of being told what women can't do. Put me with someone who's already proving them wrong." Chen showed up at my office every day for a week until I relented. The others heard rumors and requested transfer. "You've become something of a legend, Lieutenant. People want to fly with you." Sarah closed the file and looked at the general. "When do we leave?" 72 hours. We have intelligence suggesting the Falkenhorst will be in a specific operational area 5 days from now. That's our window. Miss it, and we may not get another chance before they strike." "And if we fail?" Bradford's expression didn't change. "Then a lot of people are going to die, and history will record this war very differently than we hoped." The briefing continued for 3 more hours. Intelligence analysts presented everything they knew about the Black Sun Pact, which wasn't much. Fragmentary intercepts, decoded messages that raised more questions than answers. The organization drew members from Polish nationalist groups, yes, but also German expatriates, disaffected American isolationists, and what appeared to be occultist societies that believed the war was fulfilling ancient prophecies. Their ideology was a toxic mixture of nationalism, mysticism, and apocalyptic fervor. The weapon itself remained mysterious. One intercepted message referred to it as the breath of the old gods. Another called it the perfected strain. A third, more troubling still, suggested that exposure would cause symptoms within hours and death within days, with no known cure. Chemical weapons were horror enough, but this sounded like something worse, something that could spread. "Bioweapon," Sarah said flatly. "You think they've created a plague?" "We think they might have found one," Bradford admitted. German researchers were exploring military applications of infectious diseases. Most of their work was theoretical, thank God. But if someone recovered their research, had the right resources and expertise, and lacked any moral restraints— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah met with her crew that evening at a secure hangar outside Washington. The modified B-25 sat under harsh electric lights, its metal skin gleaming, looking both familiar and alien with its modifications. Tommy Chen spotted her first and broke into a grin so wide it threatened to split his face. "Lieutenant, I knew you'd be flying again. I told everyone. They didn't believe me. But I knew." Tommy. She shook his hand, felt the strength in his grip, the calluses from hours on radio equipment. You didn't have to volunteer for this. Yes, I did. We're a crew. That matters. Susan Park was smaller than Sarah, which was saying something, with short black hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic look until you noticed the intensity in her eyes. Lieutenant Redfeather, I've studied your skip-bombing runs, the angles you used, the speeds, the timing. It shouldn't be possible. I want to learn how you did it. Instinct, Sarah said, and luck. I don't believe in luck. I believe in skill. Teach me. James Blackwood stood apart from the others, studying a navigation chart spread across a workbench. He was tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years outdoors. When he finally looked up, his dark eyes met Sarah's with an understanding that transcended words. He spoke in Navajo, a greeting that acknowledged their shared heritage without making it the defining fact of who they were. Sarah responded in Lakota, and, for a moment, they were not military personnel in an Army Air Corps hangar, but representatives of nations older than the one they now served. They told me you navigate by feel, Sarah said in English. My grandfather taught me to read the stars, the wind, the way birds fly. Same principles work at 20,000 feet. Maybe better. Up there, you're closer to the truth of things. The gunners, Rodriguez and O'Brien, were cut from different cloth but shared the same combat-hardened competence. Rodriguez was from Texas, soft-spoken and deadly accurate. O'Brien was Boston Irish, loud and profane and utterly reliable. They had flown together in the Pacific, survived crashes and fighters and flak that should have killed them. We heard stories about you, ma'am, Rodriguez said. Figured most of it was bullshit. Then we read the actual mission reports. Naval intelligence doesn't lie in official documents. Those reports were classified, Sarah said. O'Brien grinned. Yeah, well, turns out Morrison's got friends who owe him favors. He wanted us to know what we were signing up for. Seemed fair. Frank Kowalski, the flight engineer, was 52 years old and had forgotten more about aircraft maintenance than most mechanics ever learned. He had thick hands scarred from years of working with hot metal and sharp edges, and he spoke with the blunt authority of someone who had earned respect through decades of keeping birds in the air when they had no right to fly. This plane's been modified 6 ways from Sunday, he told Sarah as they inspected the bomber together. Extra fuel capacity means we're carrying more weight, structural reinforcements to handle the stress, new radio gear that's supposed to work in conditions that would scramble normal equipment, and these. He gestured to the bomb bay, where specialized munitions waited in their cradles. Incendiary clusters, not your standard payload. They're designed to burn hot enough to destroy biological material. Naval intelligence thinks if we hit the right target, we can neutralize the weapon even if we don't sink the ship immediately. If we hit the right target, Sarah repeated. That's a big if, when we don't even know what the ship looks like. Intelligence has some ideas. Converted merchant vessel, probably German-built, with modifications for long-range operation and heavy weapons. Should stand out if we can get close enough to identify it. And if we can't? Kowalski's expression was grim. Then we make our best guess and hope we're right. Not exactly precision tactics, but we're dealing with an invisible enemy and a ticking clock. Sometimes you just have to trust your gut. The next 72 hours were a blur of preparation. Flight tests with the modified bomber, learning its quirks and capabilities, briefings on the operational area, memorizing topographical features of the ocean that seemed to have no features, weapons training with the incendiary clusters, understanding blast radii and optimal release altitudes, emergency procedures for ditching in the North Atlantic, which everyone knew was a polite fiction. If they went down in winter water 400 miles from shore, they had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia killed them. Sarah spent hours with Blackwood, reviewing navigation charts by lamplight, plotting courses that accounted for wind patterns, fuel consumption, and the probability of enemy contact. He worked with slide rules and protractors, calculating angles with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. "My grandfather was a code talker in the First War," Blackwood said during one late-night session. "Never got recognition for it. They used our language because it was unbreakable, then pretended we didn't exist once the fighting stopped. He told me that our people have always been warriors. The uniform doesn't change that. It just gives us different enemies to fight." "Do you think this is our war?" Sarah asked. "Really ours? Or are we just fighting for people who see us as tools?" "Both can be true. The men who put us here don't care about justice or recognition. They care about winning. But the people we're protecting, the cities that weapon could destroy, they're full of innocents who don't deserve to die for politics they don't understand. We're not fighting for the government. We're fighting for them. That makes it our war." Susan Park was equally philosophical, but from a different angle. "My parents were immigrants," she told Sarah while they practiced target calculations in the navigator's dome. "Came through Angel Island, worked in canneries in California, saved every penny to send me to college. When the war started, some people looked at us differently, like we might be the enemy because of how we looked. But I'm as American as anyone born here. More, maybe, because my family chose this country. We fought to belong. Now I'm fighting to prove we do." The crew gelled with surprising speed. There was no hazing, no testing period where the new pilot had to prove herself. Sarah's reputation had preceded her, and, more importantly, the magnitude of the mission left no room for petty rivalries. They were 7 people volunteering for what might be a suicide run, united by skill, determination, and a shared understanding that sometimes history demands everything from those capable of giving it. On the morning of departure, General Bradford visited the hangar one final time. He looked older than he had 3 days earlier, the weight of command visible in every line of his face. "The latest intelligence puts the Falkenhorst in grid sector 7 Alpha, approximately 400 miles northeast of Newfoundland. Weather will be terrible. Storms moving through the area, visibility near zero, waves high enough to make skip bombing essentially impossible. If we're wrong about the timing or the location, you'll be flying through hell for nothing." "And if you're right," Sarah asked, "then you'll be flying through hell to save thousands of lives. Maybe more. We've identified 12 American cities with major ports as potential targets. The weapon's deployment mechanism is unknown, but prevailing theory suggests aerosol dispersal from low-flying aircraft or ship-based sprayers. Any coastal city is vulnerable. New York, Boston, Charleston, San Francisco. Millions of people who have no idea how close they are to catastrophe." The weight of it settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical thing. 15 ships had been impressive. This was something else entirely. This was being handed responsibility for preventing an atrocity that could reshape the war and scar the nation for generations. "We'll find them," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "I know you will. That's why you're going." They took off at 1400 hours under gray skies that promised nothing good. The modified B-25 lifted heavily, groaning under the weight of extra fuel and specialized munitions. Sarah coaxed it into the air with gentle hands, feeling the aircraft's reluctance, its desire to stay grounded where it was safe. Once airborne, she turned northeast and climbed to 8,000 feet, above the worst of the weather but below the altitude where ice would form on the wings and drag them down. Tommy Chen's voice came through the intercom, steady and professional, confirming radio frequencies and checking equipment. Susan Parks settled into the bombardier's position, running calculations. Blackwood hunched over his navigation table, plotting their course with instruments and intuition. The first 4 hours were uneventful, just the steady drone of engines and the vast emptiness of sky and sea. They passed over fishing boats, a convoy heading to Britain, a pod of whales that Rodriguez spotted from the waist gun position. The ocean stretched in all directions, gray and cold and infinite. Then the weather hit. It came like a wall, a front of churning clouds and sheeting rain that reduced visibility to nothing. The bomber shook and bucked, caught in turbulence that threw it sideways and made the engines scream. Sarah fought the controls, her arms burning with effort, her feet working the rudder pedals constantly to maintain heading. Lightning flashed, turning the world white for instants at a time, revealing nothing but more clouds, more rain, more chaos. "Jesus Christ," O'Brien muttered over the intercom. "This is worse than anything over the Pacific." "Stay focused," Sarah said calmly, though her heart was hammering. "Blackwood, can you keep us on course?" "Working on it," the navigator replied, his voice strained. "The winds are pushing us east, compensating, but it's like navigating through a hurricane." "Because we are," Kowalski called from the flight engineer's station. "This storm system shouldn't exist this time of year. Either we're incredibly unlucky, or someone's been reading the same weather reports we have and knew we'd be coming." The implications of that were troubling. If the Falkenhorst knew they were being hunted, they might have prepared an ambush. Or they might have relocated, making this entire mission a waste of fuel and time they didn't have. 3 more hours through the storm. Sarah's arms ached. Her eyes burned from staring into the gray void beyond the windscreen. The aircraft had picked up ice despite the altitude, adding weight and reducing efficiency. Fuel consumption was higher than projected. They would have barely enough to make it back to Newfoundland if they turned around now. "Contact!" Rodriguez's voice sharp over the intercom. 3 o'clock low. Vessel on the surface. Can't make out details, but it's big. Sarah banked right, descending through the clouds, breaking into clear air below the storm ceiling. And there it was. The ship was exactly as intelligence had described. A converted merchant vessel, maybe 400 feet long, with a cargo configuration that had been modified for military purposes. Gun emplacements lined the deck. What looked like launch tubes were visible midship. And most telling, the vessel flew no flag, no national identification, nothing that would mark it as belonging to any legitimate navy. "Is that it?" Tommy Chen asked, his voice tight. "Susan, can you confirm?" Sarah called to the bombardier. Park studied the ship through her optics, consulting the recognition guides they'd memorized. "Profile matches, size matches. Those launch tubes could be for the aerosol deployment system. I'm 90% confident this is our target." 90% isn't 100, Sarah said. "Nothing in this war is 100%. We make the best call we can with the information we have." Sarah thought of the 12 cities, the millions of people, the weapon that could turn population centers into graveyards. She thought of the men who had dismissed her as incapable, the system that had tried to sideline her, the moment when she had proven them wrong. She thought of her father, teaching her to fly, telling her that warriors were defined not by their gender or their heritage, but by their courage when the moment came. This was the moment. All crew, prepare for attack run. Susan, get ready on the bombs. Tommy, jam any radio signals from that ship. I don't want them calling for help. Rodriguez, O'Brien, you see fighters. You call them out immediately. No fighters visible, Rodriguez reported. But there's something weird about this. No escorts, no air cover, no defensive formations. Either they're incredibly confident or incredibly stupid. Or it's a trap, Blackwood said quietly. Sarah had already considered that possibility. Bait ship, draw in the hunters, then spring an ambush from concealed submarines or aircraft lurking in the clouds. It was exactly what she would do if she were the enemy commander. But they were here, the target was below, and time was running out. Sometimes you had to push forward even when instinct screamed caution. She dove. The bomber screamed toward the ocean, engines howling, the airframe shuddering from the stress. 5,000 feet. 3,000. 1,000. Sarah pulled up hard at 500 feet, leveling off, skimming toward the ship at full speed. The waves below were massive, 20-foot swells that made skip bombing almost impossible. Almost. The ship's guns opened fire. Tracers arced through the air, bright against the gray sky. Sarah jinked left, then right, her movements fluid and instinctive. The bullets passed behind them, the gunners unable to track a target moving this fast, this low. "Bombs away!" Susan called. The bomber lifted as weight released from the bay. Sarah didn't watch the bombs fall. She was already banking hard, climbing, preparing for the second pass. Behind them, the incendiaries hit. Fire blossomed on the ship's deck, white-hot flames that burned with chemical intensity. Direct hit, O'Brien confirmed. Midship section burning, but the ship's still moving. We need another pass. Sarah came around, lined up the approach, dove again. This time the ship's gunners were ready. The tracers came closer, much closer. Sarah felt the bomber shudder as rounds punched through the fuselage. "We're hit," Kowalski called. Number 2 engine taking damage. Still running, but losing oil pressure. "Can it hold?" "For now, but we can't take many more hits." Susan released the second wave of incendiaries. More fire, more destruction. The ship was burning now, flames consuming the deck, spreading to the interior. Sarah could see figures moving frantically, trying to extinguish the inferno. "That's got to be enough," Tommy Chen said. But Sarah wasn't sure. If the weapon survived, if it was in a sealed container or a protected hold, the fire might not destroy it. They needed to be certain. "One more pass," she decided. "Lieutenant, the engine," Kowalski started. "I know. One more pass, then we head home." She took them in low and fast, so low that the bomber's belly almost touched the wave crests. The ship was a floating funeral pyre now, but its guns were still firing. Desperate shots from crews who knew they were dying but refused to surrender. Something changed in the air. A shimmer, like heat haze, but wrong, unnatural. Sarah's instincts screamed warning. She banked hard left, just as the shimmer exploded into a visible field of energy, some kind of electromagnetic pulse that lit up the sky. "What the hell was that?" O'Brien yelled. Every instrument in the bomber went dark. The radios died. The navigation equipment failed. Even the engine gauges flickered and went dead. They were flying blind, relying only on Sarah's skill and the fact that the engines, mercifully, were still running. "Experimental weapon," Blackwood said grimly. "They tried to knock us out of the sky electronically." "Did it work?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. We're still flying, so no, but we've lost all navigation gear. I'm going to have to do this old school. Sarah didn't have time to worry about that now. She completed the attack run, released the last of their ordnance, and pulled up hard. Behind them, the ship exploded. Not just burned, but exploded. A massive detonation that sent a column of fire and smoke 1,000 feet into the air. "Secondary explosions," Susan reported, her voice shaking. "That wasn't just fuel. Something else went up. Maybe ammunition, maybe—" "The weapon," Sarah finished. "We destroyed it." They climbed back into the clouds, leaving the burning wreckage behind. The storm had lessened slightly, but navigation without instruments was a nightmare. Blackwood worked with compass, watch, and dead reckoning, calculating their heading by feel and experience. Sarah flew by instinct, trusting her sense of the aircraft, the wind, the subtle cues that separated experienced pilots from dead ones. The crippled number 2 engine finally gave up 90 minutes into the return flight. It seized with a grinding scream, the propeller freezing, adding drag that threatened to spiral them into the ocean. Kowalski managed to feather the prop, reducing the drag, but they were flying on one engine now, losing altitude slowly but steadily. "Can we make Newfoundland?" Sarah asked. Blackwood consulted his charts, did calculations in his head. "Maybe, if the winds are with us and the weather clears. If not—" He didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to air crews who ditched in the North Atlantic in winter. Minutes, not hours. The miles crawled past. Fuel gauges, dead like everything else electronic, left them guessing at remaining range. Blackwood navigated by the sun when it occasionally broke through the clouds, by the angle of waves on the ocean below, by techniques his grandfather had taught him that predated aviation by centuries. "Land!" Rodriguez called. "Dead ahead. Rocky coastline." They had made it. Barely, but they had made it. The landing was rough. One engine, limited control, a crosswind that tried to flip them over at the last second. Sarah brought the bomber down on a coastal airstrip that was little more than a gravel runway carved from wilderness. The aircraft bounced once, twice, skidded sideways, and finally ground to a halt, with metal screaming and tires shredding. Silence. Blessed, beautiful silence. "Everyone alive?" Sarah asked. One by one, the crew called in, shaken, bruised, but alive. All 7 of them had survived. They climbed out of the bomber into cold air that tasted like freedom. Tommy Chen started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound born of relief and adrenaline crash. Susan Park sat on the wing, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't light a cigarette. Blackwood walked off into the wilderness for a few minutes, speaking prayers in Navajo to whoever might be listening. Sarah looked at the battered bomber, at the holes in its fuselage, at the dead engine, and the scorched metal from the electromagnetic pulse. They had been impossibly lucky. Skill alone shouldn't have been enough to bring them through. But luck and skill together, combined with courage and teamwork and desperation, had somehow been sufficient. A week later, they were back in Washington, standing in the same windowless conference room, facing General Bradford across the same table. This time, though, there were others present. Admirals, intelligence chiefs, people whose names Sarah would never know and whose roles were so classified they couldn't be discussed. "The ship is confirmed destroyed," Bradford said. "Naval Patrol found debris and bodies, all deceased from the fire or drowning. Chemical analysis of the wreckage detected traces of engineered pathogens, enough to confirm that the weapon was real and was aboard. Your attack destroyed it completely. The heat from those incendiaries burned hot enough to neutralize the biological agents. You saved lives, Lieutenant. Potentially hundreds of thousands. What about the rest of the pact? Sarah asked. Bradford's expression darkened. That's ongoing. The organization is larger than we initially believed, with cells operating in multiple countries. Taking down the Falkenhorst was a major blow, but it's not over. We're still hunting the leadership, still tracking their funding sources and connections. It's going to be a long fight. Then I should be part of it. You will be, but not the way you expect. He slid a folder across the table. Sarah opened it and found orders. Not reassignment orders, promotion orders. She was being promoted to captain and given command of a new unit, a specialized tactical air group designed for high-risk missions against unconventional targets. You've proven that there are threats conventional forces can't handle effectively, Bradford continued. We need flexibility, innovation, people who can think outside traditional military doctrine. You and your crew represent a new way of fighting. We're making it official. Sarah looked at the promotion papers, at the description of the new unit, at the resources and authority being placed in her hands. It was everything she had fought for and more. But there was something else in the folder. A photograph. A man's face, European features, cold eyes, standing on the deck of what looked like another ship. The caption read, Viktor Stanislav, Black Sun Pact Commander. Current whereabouts unknown. There's always another mission, Sarah said quietly. Always, Bradford agreed. The question is whether you're ready for the next one. She thought of the burning ship, the desperate flight home, the way her crew had come together under impossible pressure and emerged stronger. She thought of her father, who had been denied the chance to serve as a pilot, but had passed his knowledge to her. She thought of all the people like her, like Tommy and James and Susan, who had been told they weren't capable, weren't suitable, weren't warrior material, and who had proven the doubters catastrophically wrong. I'm ready, she said, and deep in her bones, in the place where instinct lived, where the spirit of flight and the call to battle merged into something indefinable but absolutely certain, she knew it was true. The war wasn't over. New enemies waited beyond the horizon, but she had a crew she trusted, a mission she believed in, and the freedom to prove, over and over again, that courage and skill recognized no boundaries of gender or heritage or expectation. She was a warrior, a pilot, an American and a Lakota, and a woman and a symbol of what was possible when institutions finally, grudgingly, got out of the way and let the capable do what they had always been able to do. The sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it, and Sarah Redfeather had claimed it utterly, forever, without apology or hesitation. The story of her war was just beginning. Have you ever wondered what incredible secrets lie hidden in America's military archives? Stories of extraordinary courage deliberately concealed from history books. What would you say if I told you that one of the most decorated soldiers of the Civil War wasn't who everyone thought they were, that beneath a battle-hardened exterior beat the heart of an indigenous woman whose true identity remained hidden for nearly a century? Before I reveal this astonishing story of courage, deception, and sacrifice, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue bringing these buried truths to light. Stories, powerful interests have worked for generations to keep hidden from public knowledge. In the bitter winter of 1861, as the first shots of the Civil War echoed across a divided nation, a slight but determined figure approached a Union Army recruitment office in Boston, Massachusetts. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with copper skin that spoke of mixed heritage, the young recruit gave the name Robert Yellowbird and claimed to be a 22-year-old man of partial Mohawk descent from upstate New York. Military records show that Yellowbird was assigned to the 20th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a regiment that would become known as the Harvard Regiment due to its many college-educated officers. What those records failed to reveal, what would remain hidden until 1957, was that Robert Yellowbird was actually Rebecca Watona, a 20-year-old Cherokee woman who had traveled over 800 miles from her home in Georgia, assuming a male identity to fight for a cause she deeply believed in. This was not simply a case of a woman disguising herself as a man to follow a husband or brother into war, which happened with some frequency during the Civil War, explains Dr. Eleanor Whitehorse, professor of Indigenous American History at Columbia University. This was a Native American woman who deliberately crossed both gender and cultural boundaries, risking everything to fight for the Union cause, and, as her private journals would later reveal, for the freedom of all oppressed peoples. Watona's extraordinary deception was only discovered nearly a century after her death, when her granddaughter, Martha Kingsley, discovered a sealed trunk in her attic containing Watona's wartime journals, personal effects, and a detailed confession written in 1893 but never published. The discovery sent shockwaves through military historical circles and forced a re-evaluation of Indigenous participation in the Civil War. When I opened that trunk, I expected family heirlooms, maybe some old clothes, Kingsley recalled in a 1958 interview. Instead, I found myself face to face with an ancestor I'd never truly known, a warrior who had carried secrets to her grave that would have been unthinkable to reveal during her lifetime. The journal entries, written in a precise, educated hand, revealed a remarkable life journey that began far from the battlefields where Watona would distinguish herself. Born in 1841 to a Cherokee mother and a Scottish-American father in northern Georgia, she was raised in the shadow of the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of Cherokee people that had occurred less than a decade before her birth. Her mother, one of the few who had managed to remain in Georgia by hiding in the mountains, had instilled in her daughter both traditional Cherokee values and a fierce commitment to justice. "My mother speaks of freedom as one who has seen it stolen," Watona wrote in an early journal entry. "She has taught me that to be truly free, one must sometimes fight against impossible odds. The whites have their war now, brother against brother. They fight over the freedom of black men while blind to the bondage of red ones. Yet I believe this conflict may reshape the land for all of us, if the right side prevails." Watona's father, James Kingsley, had been unusual among white settlers in his respect for Cherokee culture. A self-educated man with progressive views, he had taught his daughter to read and write in both English and Cherokee, exposing her to political philosophy and current events through newspapers and books he brought from his occasional trips to Atlanta. When he died of tuberculosis in 1857, Watona was left to care for her mother, whose health was also failing. "Father's passing leaves a void that cannot be filled," she wrote. "But he has prepared me for a world that will not be kind to a woman of mixed blood. I can read the words of Jefferson and Paine. I can calculate sums that would confound many a schoolmaster. I can speak as the whites do, when necessary. These are weapons as surely as any rifle." Those weapons would serve her well when, following her mother's death in 1860, she made the fateful decision to head north. The journals describe her gradual transformation from Rebecca to Robert, cutting her hair, binding her chest, practicing lowering her naturally soft voice, and studying the mannerisms of men she observed. She worked briefly in Philadelphia, saving money while perfecting her male persona, before the outbreak of war presented an unexpected opportunity. "The recruiting officer barely glanced at me," she recorded after her enlistment. "They are desperate for bodies to fill their ranks, and they ask few questions of those willing to serve. My hands, calloused from years of work, raised no suspicions. My knowledge of weapons, learned from hunting with my father, impressed the sergeant. Tomorrow we begin training, and my true battle commences, not just against the Confederacy, but against discovery. Military historians now recognize that Watona's experience was not unique. Hundreds of women are estimated to have fought disguised as men during the Civil War. What sets her case apart was both her indigenous identity and the exceptional service record she compiled under her assumed name. Robert Yellowbird appears in multiple commendation reports, notes military historian Dr. Thomas Blackwood. The official record shows participation in 17 major engagements, including Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness Campaign. Yellowbird was wounded twice, promoted 3 times for bravery under fire, and mentioned specifically in dispatches for heroism during the Battle of Gettysburg. Those official records, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. Watona's journals reveal the daily stress and physical challenges of maintaining her disguise in the intimate conditions of camp life. She described binding her chest so tightly that she sometimes struggled to breathe during long marches, timing her bathing for the darkest hours of night, and developing a cover story about facial scarring from a childhood accident to explain her lack of beard growth. "I have become a master of deflection," she wrote in October 1862. "When the men speak of sweethearts or boast of conquests, I tell tales of a fictional fiancée waiting in New York. I have created her so vividly in my stories that the men now ask for news of Sweet Catherine whenever mail arrives. Some deceptions require a foundation of truths, and I have built Catherine from memories of a Cherokee girl I once loved in my youth. Though such feelings were another secret I could never reveal at home." This reference to romantic feelings for another woman represents one of several passages suggesting that Watona's gender identity was more complex than simply a woman disguising herself for practical purposes. Some scholars have suggested that her comfort in a male role may indicate what modern terminology would describe as a non-binary or transgender identity, though others caution against imposing contemporary concepts on historical figures. Watona's writings show remarkable comfort with her male persona, observes Dr. Sarah Running Deer, professor of gender studies and indigenous history at UCLA. Unlike many other documented cases of women who fought as men during the Civil War, she never expresses longing to return to female presentation. Instead, she writes about the freedom and authenticity she feels in male attire, suggesting that her gender journey was about more than just accessing male privilege or serving in the military. Regardless of how Watona understood her own identity, her skill as a soldier is beyond dispute. Her first true test came at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, where the 20th Massachusetts suffered terrible casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Ferdinand Dreher, commanding the regiment, specifically mentioned Private Yellowbird in his after-action report. Private R. Yellowbird demonstrated exceptional courage, twice crossing open ground under heavy fire to retrieve wounded comrades. When Lieutenant Wheeler fell, Yellowbird assumed command of the detail and maintained position despite being significantly outmanned. This action earned Yellowbird a battlefield promotion to corporal, the first of several advancements that would eventually lead to the rank of sergeant by war's end. The promotion brought increased responsibility, but also increased scrutiny, creating new challenges for maintaining her secret. "The officers look more closely at non-commissioned officers," she wrote after her promotion. "I must be ever vigilant now. Major Wilson has taken a particular interest in my background, curious about my mixed heritage and education. I provide enough truth to satisfy without revealing too much. I speak of my father's Scottish origins and my mother's Mohawk blood rather than Cherokee, as there are several Mohawk men in the Union forces who might be presumed to be distant kin while the Cherokee are far from here and associated with the South. This careful management of her fictional biography reflected a sophisticated understanding of how racial and cultural assumptions could be manipulated to her advantage. By claiming Mohawk rather than Cherokee ancestry, she reduced the likelihood of her story being questioned or investigated. She also strategically emphasized her father's influence to explain her education and facility with English, playing into period assumptions about Indigenous capabilities. Despite these precautions, there were several close calls. Her journals describe a particularly dangerous moment following the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, where she received a minor wound to her thigh. The field hospital was chaos, men screaming and dying all around. When the surgeon approached to examine my leg, I claimed the wound was superficial and needed only bandaging. He insisted on proper treatment, reaching for my trouser leg. In desperation, I seized a nearby flask of whiskey and poured it directly on the wound, letting out a howl that was not entirely feigned. The pain was searing, but it had the desired effect. The surgeon laughed at my frontier medicine and allowed me to bandage myself, saying I'd saved him time he could devote to more serious cases. I cleaned and stitched the wound myself that night, biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. This incident highlights not only the ingenuity that kept her secret safe, but also the additional suffering she endured to maintain her disguise. While male soldiers could receive appropriate medical care, Watona was forced to treat her own injuries or risk exposure. The long-term physical toll of such self-treatment, combined with the constant pressure of binding her chest, would contribute to chronic health problems later in life. By 1863, Sergeant Yellowbird had earned a reputation for exceptional scouting abilities and woodland knowledge that made her particularly valuable to the regiment. Her commanding officers attributed these skills to her indigenous heritage, never suspecting that they actually reflected traditional knowledge passed down through her mother's Cherokee line rather than the Mohawk identity she claimed. Yellowbird's ability to move silently through wooded terrain and read subtle signs of enemy movement has proven invaluable, wrote Captain Samuel Willard in a regimental report following a successful reconnaissance mission near Chancellorsville. On 3 occasions, his warnings of concealed enemy positions have saved the company from potential ambush. Such natural abilities, combined with unwavering courage and intelligence, make him an exemplary non-commissioned officer despite his youth. This recognition led to Watona being frequently assigned to scouting and reconnaissance duties, roles that paradoxically provided both greater danger and greater privacy. While operating in small detachments, or sometimes alone behind enemy lines, she faced increased risk of capture or death, but decreased risk of her secret being discovered by her own comrades. Her most significant military contribution came during the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. The 20th Massachusetts was positioned on Cemetery Ridge, directly in the path of Pickett's charge on the battle's 3rd day. As Confederate forces prepared for their fateful assault, Sergeant Yellowbird was returning from a scouting mission and observed the massive formation assembling. Official reports credit Yellowbird with providing crucial advance warning of the impending attack, allowing Union forces valuable time to prepare their defenses. What those reports don't mention, but Watona's journal describes in detail, is how she obtained that information. I encountered a Confederate deserter, a Cherokee man from North Carolina who had been conscripted against his will. He recognized something in me that others do not see, perhaps the way I move or some quality of spirit that marks me as Cherokee despite my disguise. He spoke to me in our language, startling me deeply, and revealed the planned assault. I should have taken him prisoner, but instead directed him toward Union lines where he might surrender safely. Away from my unit, where questions about our exchange might arise. Some loyalties transcend this white man's war. This encounter represented one of several moments when Watona's Cherokee identity created connections across battle lines. Her journals mention at least 3 instances where she encountered other Indigenous soldiers fighting for either the Union or Confederacy, exchanges that often involved complex negotiations of tribal, national, and military identities. To the Lakota scout attached to the 5th New York, "I am a fellow warrior on a shared path," she wrote after one such meeting. "To my commanding officer, I am a reliable sergeant with useful skills. To my comrades, I am a quiet, educated half-breed who keeps to himself. Only in these pages can I be fully myself, a Cherokee woman walking between worlds, belonging completely to none." This sense of existing between multiple worlds intensified as the war progressed. By 1864, as the conflict ground toward its bloody conclusion, Watonah had spent nearly 3 years living as Robert Yellowbird. Her journals from this period reveal increasing physical toll, but also a growing sense of purpose. The men speak constantly of returning home, to wives and sweethearts and former lives. She wrote in April 1864, "I have no such home to return to. The woman I was has faded like morning mist. The man I present as has no existence beyond these battlefields. Yet I have found purpose in this strange half-life, fighting not just for union, but for a future where people of all kinds might claim their freedom. If I die here, at least I will have lived and fallen as a warrior." That fate nearly came to pass during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in May 1864. In some of the war's most intense fighting, Sergeant Yellowbird led a small detachment defending a section of the infamous Bloody Angle, a bend in the Confederate defensive works that became the site of nearly 24 hours of continuous hand-to-hand combat. Captain William Bartlett's official report described Yellowbird's actions. Sergeant Yellowbird, despite sustaining a severe wound to the shoulder early in the engagement, refused evacuation and maintained command of his position for 11 hours of continuous combat. When ammunition ran low, he organized a collection party that retrieved cartridge boxes from the fallen under heavy fire. His position was never relinquished, and upon relief, he collapsed from loss of blood but refused preferential treatment, insisting that enlisted men be tended first. Watonah's own account of the battle is more visceral. "I have seen the face of war stripped of all glory or purpose. Men tore at each other like animals, fighting over a mud wall as if it were the gateway to paradise. My wound came early, a ball passing clean through the muscle above my collarbone. The pain was immediate and blinding, but to leave my men was unthinkable. I bounded as best I could, and continued. By nightfall, we fought over barricades of our own dead. When relief finally came, I believed I might die, and felt only gratitude that I would be recorded as falling as Sergeant Yellowbird, rather than being discovered in a field hospital as Rebecca Watonah. This wound proved more serious than her previous injuries, and necessitated actual medical treatment. How she maintained her secret during this vulnerable period is described in a remarkable passage. "Providence sent me an unexpected guardian. The field surgeon, Dr. Jenkins, began cutting away my bloodied shirt, despite my protests. Before he could expose my binding, his orderly, a contraband man named Isaiah, who had escaped slavery in Virginia, deliberately knocked over the surgical table. In the ensuing chaos of scattered instruments, Isaiah whispered to me, 'I know what you are. My sister fought at Manassas the same way. Let me help you.' When the doctor returned, Isaiah had already bandaged my torso, claiming he'd done so to staunch bleeding, while the doctor was occupied with other patients. That night, Isaiah brought me fresh bandages and helped me rebind myself properly, his dark hands gentle and his eyes understanding. 'Some risks are worth taking,' he said, 'when the cause is just.'" This account represents one of the earliest documented instances of cooperation between an African-American man and an indigenous woman in American military context. a reminder of the complex alliances and identities that existed beneath the surface of the Civil War's simpler narratives. The wound suffered at Spotsylvania would trouble Watona for the rest of her life, leaving her with limited mobility in her left arm and chronic pain. Nevertheless, she returned to duty after 6 weeks of recovery and served through the remainder of the war, participating in the siege of Petersburg and witnessing the Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. As the war ended and the 20th Massachusetts prepared for demobilization, Sergeant Yellowbird faced a new crisis. What would become of Robert Yellowbird in peacetime? The journals reveal careful consideration of various options, including continuing to live as a man, revealing her true identity, or creating yet another new persona. "Peace presents challenges that war did not," she wrote in June 1865. "In battle, men look for courage and reliability. In peace, they will look more closely at the quiet sergeant with no family waiting and no future plans. Some of my comrades speak of heading west to seek fortunes. Perhaps in those open spaces I might find a path forward, though whether as Robert or Rebecca remains uncertain." The official military record shows that Sergeant Robert Yellowbird was honorably discharged in July 1865, receiving a commendation for exemplary service and uncommon valor, along with back pay and a veteran's pension certificate. Where many historical accounts of women who fought as men end with discharge or discovery, Watona's story continued for decades, and in many ways became even more remarkable. After brief consideration of returning to Georgia, Watona decided that Robert Yellowbird would journey west, following the path of many other Civil War veterans seeking new beginnings on the frontier. Her journals describe traveling first to St. Louis, then to Kansas City, working various jobs and carefully maintaining her male identity. "I find it strange that what began as necessity has become comfortable, almost natural," she wrote in October 1865. "To return to skirts and submissiveness now seems more a disguise than the trousers and freedom I have claimed. Yet I remain between worlds, not fully man nor woman, not fully white nor Cherokee, not fully anything except myself. Perhaps that is enough." This philosophical acceptance of her liminal identity would be tested when, in 1867, she arrived in the newly established Colorado Territory and encountered an unexpected opportunity. A land agent in Denver, impressed by her military record and literacy, offered her a position as a government liaison to indigenous communities in the region. The role would capitalize on her status as a perceived civilized Indian who had served the Union cause, a rare combination that territorial officials believed would help in negotiations with local tribes. The irony of a Cherokee woman disguised as a half-Mohawk man being hired to represent U.S. government interests to other indigenous peoples was not lost on Watona. Her journals from this period reveal complex feelings about the role. "I have become an interpreter between worlds in more ways than anyone could possibly understand. When I translate between English and Cheyenne, I am also translating between the man they believe me to be and the woman I was born as, between the loyal Union veteran I appear and the Cherokee who understands all too well the broken promises these Western tribes are being offered." This position brought her into contact with numerous tribal leaders and U.S. officials during a critical period in Western history. Her unique perspective, a Cherokee intimately familiar with the long history of broken treaties, passing as a male government representative, allowed her to subtly influence some negotiations in ways that benefited indigenous communities, while still maintaining her cover and government position. In council today, I deliberately mistranslated the agent's more threatening statements, softening ultimatums into requests. She recorded after one particularly tense negotiation in 1868. "When translating the Arapaho chief's words, I strengthened his position by framing his concerns in terms the white officials respect. property rights, and prior agreements, rather than sacred relationships to the land. Neither side realizes I am reshaping their words, finding the narrow path between their positions where some justice might yet grow. It is dangerous work, this subtle resistance, yet perhaps the most important battle I have fought. For 5 years, Robert Yellowbird served in this liaison capacity, building a reputation for fairness and effectiveness that led to promotions and increased responsibilities. During this period, Watona's journals document growing connections with local communities, particularly with Indigenous women who sometimes perceived aspects of her true identity despite her disguise. In 1872, after 5 years of government service, Watona's life took an unexpected turn when she met Sarah Littlefeather, a northern Cheyenne woman working as an interpreter for her tribe. Their initial professional relationship quickly deepened into a profound connection that would alter the course of Watona's carefully constructed life. There is something about Sarah that unsettles and attracts me, Watona wrote in November 1872. She watches me with eyes that seem to see beneath the surface. Yesterday, as we prepared for the Treaty Council, she spoke to me in Cheyenne rather than English, saying words that translated roughly as sister spirit in brother form. When I asked what she meant, she simply smiled and said some people carry both masculine and feminine spirits, and among her people, such individuals are considered specially gifted rather than deceptive. For Teak, this encounter marked the first time in more than a decade that Watona had been recognized as something other than the male persona she presented. Not as a woman disguising herself, but as a being with a complex gender identity that traditional Cheyenne culture had frameworks to understand and respect. Over the following months, a deep bond formed between them. Sarah gradually became Watona's confidant, the first person since the war to whom she revealed her full identity and history. Rather than rejection or exposure, Sarah offered understanding and companionship. I have lived so long in fear of discovery that I hardly know how to exist without it. Watona confessed in her journal after revealing her secret. Sarah accepts all that I am, Cherokee and educated, woman and warrior, neither fully one thing nor another. She calls me Two-Spirit in her language, a sacred designation rather than a shameful secret. For the first time since childhood, I feel fully seen and not diminished by that seeing. BT, their relationship deepened into a lifelong partnership that would require its own careful negotiations with societal expectations. In the spring of 1873, they developed a plan that would allow them to build a life together while protecting Watona's secret and respecting both their cultures. Robert Yellowbird officially resigned from government service, using the military pension and savings accumulated over years of work to purchase a small ranch near the border between Colorado Territory and Wyoming. The property was strategically located, remote enough for privacy, but accessible to both white settlements and Indigenous communities traveling between reservations and traditional territories. The public story they created was straightforward. Robert Yellowbird, Civil War veteran and former government liaison, had married Sarah Littlefeather in a small private ceremony and established a homestead where they would raise horses and cattle. In an era of limited documentation and frontier flexibility, this narrative raised few questions. We have created a third identity for me now, Watona reflected. Not Rebecca the Cherokee woman, not Robert the male soldier, but something between them. A public person who lives as Sarah's husband, while privately being something more complex. Sarah says I need not choose between these selves, but can honor all parts of who I am. It is a freedom I never imagined possible. Their ranch quickly became known as a safe stopping place for Indigenous travelers moving through the region, particularly for those navigating between the official reservation system and traditional territories. Yellowbird Ranch, as it became known, developed a reputation for hospitality, fair trading, and discretion, a place where both native and white visitors were treated with equal respect. This unique position allowed Watona and Sarah to serve as important, if unofficial, intermediaries during the increasingly tense relations between indigenous nations and the expanding American state in the 1870s. Their ranch became a neutral ground where information could be exchanged, grievances aired, and sometimes conflicts avoided through timely communication. "Our home has become a crossroads between worlds," Watona wrote in 1875. "Last week, we hosted both a Lakota hunting party returning from traditional grounds and a cavalry detachment the following day. Neither knew of the other's visit. To the Lakota, we are allies who understand their struggles. To the soldiers, we are a civilized Indian household demonstrating successful assimilation. Both see what they expect to see, while we navigate the dangerous currents between these opposed forces." This delicate balancing act became increasingly difficult as conflicts intensified following the discovery of gold in the Black Hills and the subsequent Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877. Watona's military background and government connections made her suspect to some indigenous groups, while her known sympathy for native concerns raised eyebrows among territorial officials. The most significant crisis came in the aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876. As the U.S. Army intensified operations against indigenous communities across the region, Yellow Bird Ranch became a refuge for several Cheyenne families fleeing the violence, relatives of Sarah who had been separated from the main group during the fighting. "We harbor 15 souls now," Watona recorded in August 1876. 3 men, 7 women, and 5 children, all exhausted and terrified. The Army is scouring the region for any indigenous people not on reservations, considering all hostiles regardless of their actual involvement in the fighting. If discovered giving shelter to these families, we would face serious consequences. I as a traitor to the government I once served, Sarah as an accomplice. Yet to turn them away would be a greater betrayal of everything I have come to believe about justice and humanity. For 3 tense weeks, they concealed the families in a network of natural caves on their property, bringing food and supplies under cover of darkness. When cavalry patrols visited the ranch, Robert Yellowbird leveraged his status as a decorated Union veteran to deflect suspicion, sharing coffee and war stories with officers while fugitives hid less than a mile away. This dangerous situation resolved when Watona was able to arrange safe passage for the families to relatives on the newly established Northern Cheyenne Reservation, using contacts from her government liaison days to secure travel permits. This successful protection of vulnerable people marked a turning point in how Watona understood her unique position and responsibilities. "I have spent so many years concerned with maintaining my own secret that I sometimes forgot the purpose behind it," she reflected afterward. "This deception I live is not merely for my own comfort or safety, but allows me to exist in the spaces between opposed worlds where I can sometimes make difference. Perhaps this is why the Creator made me as I am, to bridge divides that others cannot cross." This philosophical acceptance of her complex identity coincided with a period of relative stability and prosperity for the ranch. Through the late 1870s and 1880s, Yellowbird Ranch expanded its operations, becoming known for quality horses, particularly suited to the regional terrain. The business provided financial security that allowed Watona and Sarah to support various community initiatives, from education for indigenous children to medical care for both native and settler communities. Throughout this period, Watona maintained her male identity in public, while exploring a more fluid gender expression in private. Her journals describe how, within the safety of their home, she sometimes returned to certain aspects of feminine presentation, while retaining the confidence and authority she had developed as Robert. "Sarah has gifted me a beautifully beaded dress in the Cheyenne style, not to replace my usual attire, but to honor the completeness of who I am," she wrote on her 50th birthday in 1891. I wear it in the privacy of our home on special occasions, not as a disguise or a return to womanhood, as defined by white society, but as an acknowledgement of the feminine aspects of my spirit. This integration of selves feels like a hard-won wisdom after decades of necessary division. This period of relative peace was interrupted in 1890 by the Ghost Dance movement and subsequent Wounded Knee Massacre. Although geographically distant from the immediate violence, the events had profound impacts on Indigenous communities throughout the West and forced Wattona to confront painful parallels to her own people's earlier tragedies. News of the massacre has affected me more deeply than I could have anticipated, she wrote in January 1891. The reports describe tactics chillingly similar to those used against the Cherokee during my mother's youth, the surrounding of unarmed people, the indiscriminate firing into crowds including women and children, the shallow mass graves afterward. After nearly 30 years living as Robert Yellowbird, I find myself dreaming in my mother's voice, remembering stories she told of our people's suffering. The wounds of history reopen across generations. This resurgence of historical trauma coincided with health challenges as Wattona entered her 50s. The physical toll of her military service, particularly the poorly healed wound from Spotsylvania, combined with decades of chest binding and the harsh realities of frontier life, began to manifest in chronic pain and respiratory difficulties. Sarah's traditional medical knowledge and care became crucial during this period, as seeking conventional medical treatment risked exposure of Wattona's biological sex. Together they managed her declining health through a combination of indigenous healing practices, careful self-treatment, and occasional consultations with a trusted physician in Denver, who believed he was treating war injuries in an aging male veteran. It was during one such health crisis in 1893, following a severe bout of pneumonia that nearly claimed her life, that Wattona made the decision to record her full story. Over several months of recovery, she compiled a detailed manuscript describing her journey from Cherokee girl to Union soldier to frontier rancher, including her motivations, challenges, and reflections on gender, identity, and belonging in America. I do not write this for publication now, she explained in the manuscript's introduction. Such revelations would create difficulties for Sarah and others connected to me, but I cannot bear the thought that when I pass from this world, the truth of who I was and what I lived through might be lost. Perhaps in another generation, when attitudes have evolved and the wounds of these wars have scarred over, this account might help others who find themselves existing between established categories of being. This manuscript, sealed and entrusted to Sarah with instructions for its eventual handling, would become the document discovered by her granddaughter more than 60 years later. Its existence remained unknown to the wider world throughout Wattona's lifetime, as she continued to live as Robert Yellowbird until her death. The final decade of Wattona's life saw gradual withdrawal from public engagement as her health continued to decline. The ranch operations were increasingly managed by trusted employees, including several young men of mixed Indigenous and European descent who viewed the aging Civil War veteran as a mentor and role model. One such protege was Thomas Kingsley, the son of a Cheyenne mother and white father, who began working at the ranch as a teenager in 1895. Recognizing something of herself in the young man navigating between cultures, Wattona took a special interest in his development, teaching him not only ranching skills, but also literacy, history, and philosophy during the long winter evenings. Young Thomas reminds me of myself at his age, caught between worlds, belonging fully to none, she wrote in 1897. I see in him the same hunger for knowledge, the same restless questioning of established boundaries. Though I cannot tell him my full truth, I try to convey what wisdom I've gained from a lifetime of crossing borders, between male and female, white and indigenous, military and civilian, traditional and modern. He represents a new generation that may someday build bridges where my generation mainly saw walls. What Watona could not have anticipated was that this mentorship would create the family lineage that would eventually preserve and reveal her story. In 1900, as her health severely declined, she and Sarah made the decision to legally adopt Thomas, then 23, as their son and heir to the ranch. This pragmatic arrangement ensured the property and business would remain in sympathetic hands while providing for Sarah's security after Watona's death. Robert Yellowbird died on April 17, 1901, at the age of 60. The official cause was recorded as complications from old war wounds and pneumonia. The funeral was well attended by both white settlers and indigenous representatives, a testament to the respect Yellowbird had earned across communities. The Denver Post published a substantial obituary highlighting the decorated Union veteran's military service, government work, and contributions to regional development, noting that few frontiersmen better exemplified the integration of civilized values with indigenous knowledge. Sarah Littlefeather Yellowbird continued to live on the ranch with their adopted son Thomas until her own death in 1912. Before passing, she transferred to Thomas not only the sealed manuscript, but also Watona's Civil War journals, military commendations, and personal effects, an archive of a remarkable life lived in disguise. She extracted from him a promise that these materials would be preserved but not revealed until at least 50 years had passed, allowing all who had known Robert Yellowbird personally to have passed from the scene. Thomas Kingsley honored this promise, eventually passing the materials to his daughter Martha with the same instructions. It was Martha who, in 1957, 56 years after Watona's death, finally opened the sealed manuscript and discovered the extraordinary truth about her grandfather's mentor and benefactor. The revelation stunned Martha, who had grown up hearing stories about the respected Civil War veteran who had founded their family ranch. After consulting with historians and verifying the authenticity of the materials through military records and other documentation, she made the decision to share Watona's story with the world. The initial publication of excerpts from Watona's manuscript in a historical journal in 1958 created immediate academic interest but limited public awareness. It wasn't until 1972, amid growing interest in both women's history and indigenous perspectives, that a complete edition of Watona's writings was published under the title Warrior Between Worlds: The Secret Life of Rebecca Watona. The publication coincided with broader societal reassessments of gender, identity, and historical narratives. For military historians, Watona's detailed accounts of Civil War battles from an enlisted perspective provided valuable primary source.
At 6:58 a.m. on October 25, 1944, lookouts aboard USS Samuel B. Roberts spotted 4 Japanese battleships emerging 15 miles northwest as the destroyer escort steamed off Samar Island, Philippines. The Roberts displaced 1,745 tons with 2 5-inch guns and a crew of 224 sailors who had been together for exactly 5 months and 27 days since commissioning. Leading the enemy formation was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons with 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds, 25 miles. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland picked up the intercom microphone and informed his crew of the situation. A large Japanese fleet had been contacted 15 miles away. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, multiple destroyers, all heading directly toward the American task force. Copeland told them this would be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. They would do what damage they could. The Japanese center force consisted of 23 warships, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, total tonnage 200,000 tons. Opposing them were 6 American escort carriers designed to fight submarines, screened by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, 7 small ships, total tonnage 25,000 tons. The Japanese outweighed them 8-1. Admiral William Halsey had taken every American battleship north overnight, chasing Japanese carriers. He left Taffy 3 alone off Samar. American intelligence reported the Japanese center force retreating after yesterday's air attacks. They weren't retreating. At 3 a.m., they had transited San Bernardino Strait undetected. Now they were here, closing at 30 knots. Escort carriers could make 18 knots maximum. They couldn't outrun battleships. In the Pacific War so far, 53 destroyer escorts had been commissioned. None had ever engaged enemy battleships. Doctrine called for screening convoys against submarines, not charging battleships. In the previous 3 months, Japanese naval forces had sunk 4 American escort carriers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Standard survival rate for carrier crews in surface actions was 40%. 1,200 sailors had died in those engagements. At 7:05 a.m., Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered his screen to attack. 3 destroyers turned toward the enemy: Johnston, Howell, Heermann. Behind them came 4 destroyer escorts. Roberts was last in line. They had minutes before Japanese guns opened fire. Will this tiny ship survive charging Yamato? Please like to honor their courage and subscribe for more. Back to Roberts. Below decks, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Lloyd Trowbridge heard Copeland's announcement over the intercom. Navy regulations limited the Roberts to 24 knots. Safety mechanisms prevented the boilers from exceeding design specifications. Trowbridge walked to the main control panel and started bypassing every safety system the Navy had installed. His crew watched. Nobody spoke. They understood. 24 knots would not be enough. At 7:16 a.m., Johnston opened fire first. Shells arced toward the Japanese fleet. The enemy returned fire immediately. 14-inch shells from battleship Congo. Water columns erupted 200 feet high. The destroyer disappeared into smoke. At 7:23 a.m., the Roberts turned toward the enemy. Copeland ordered flank speed. Trowbridge's modifications pushed the destroyer escort to 28 knots, 4 knots faster than design specifications. The ship vibrated. Metal groaned. Steam pressure gauges climbed into the red zone. Nobody cared. Speed was life. The Japanese fleet spread across 10 miles of ocean. Yamato steamed in the center. Heavy cruiser Chikuma led the right flank, 8 miles ahead of the battleship. Cruiser Tone followed 2 miles behind Chikuma. To the left, cruisers Haguro and Chokai closed on the American carriers. Between them, destroyers formed a screening line. The Roberts had to penetrate that screen, reach torpedo range, fire, escape. Torpedo range was 5,000 yards, 2.8 miles. Roberts' 3 Mark 15 torpedoes could travel that distance at 46 knots. But getting within 5,000 yards meant running through a gauntlet of shells from ships that could hit targets at 25,000 yards. The math was simple. For every mile the Roberts advanced, the Japanese could fire 5 miles worth of shells at her. At 7:32 a.m., shells began falling around the destroyer escort. 8-inch rounds from heavy cruiser Chikuma. Green dye markers in the splashes helped Japanese spotters track their aim. 1 shell landed 50 yards off the port bow. Another struck 20 yards to starboard. Water columns towered over the ship's mast. Copeland ordered hard left rudder, then hard right. Zigzag pattern. Keep the enemy guessing. Make their rangefinders work. Gun Captain Lieutenant William Burton stood in the forward 5-inch gun mount. His crew had trained for 6 months, fired thousands of practice rounds. Never against battleships. The forward gun could fire 15 rounds per minute with a trained crew. Burton had a trained crew. He also had 608 rounds of ammunition total, 304 per gun. At 15 rounds per minute, that gave him 20 minutes of continuous fire. If he didn't conserve ammunition, the Roberts would run dry before the battle ended. Burton's gun crew consisted of 10 men: loader, rammer, powderman, fuse setter, trainer, pointer, gun captain, 3 ammunition handlers. Average age, 22. 2 had never been in combat before today. The other 8 had fought submarine contacts. This was different. Submarines didn't shoot back with 14-inch guns. At 7:38 a.m., Copeland announced over the intercom they were closing for torpedo attack. The Roberts was 7,000 yards from Chikuma. Still too far. Copeland needed to close another 2,000 yards. 2 more minutes at 28 knots. 2 more minutes of shells falling around his ship. One direct hit from an 8-inch shell would penetrate the Roberts' thin hull plating, detonate inside, kill everyone in that compartment. The forward gun mount had 3/8-inch steel plating, designed to stop shrapnel, not 8-inch shells. If a shell hit the mount directly, all 10 men inside would die instantly. At 7:40 a.m., the Roberts crossed 5,000 yards from Tacoma, torpedo range. Copeland ordered the tubes fired. 3 Mark 15 torpedoes launched from the starboard side. White wakes traced across the water at 46 knots. Travel time to target approximately 2 minutes. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal. The Roberts immediately reversed course. Hard left rudder, full speed away from the enemy. Disappear into the smokescreen before the Japanese could track her. Chakuma's lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes. The cruiser turned hard to port. Emergency maneuver. Her rudder went to maximum angle. 8,000 tons of warship heeled over. The first torpedo passed 50 yards ahead of her bow. The second missed the stern. The third ran underneath without detonating. Contact exploders on Mark 15 torpedoes had a 40% failure rate. The Roberts had just fired 3 duds, but Copeland had achieved something more valuable than a hit. Chakuma had turned away from the carriers, broken off her attack run. The heavy cruiser was now heading northwest, away from Taffy 3. She'd lost 5 minutes of pursuit time. 5 minutes the escort carriers could use to run south. 5 minutes closer to potential rescue from Admiral Halsey's fleet. At 7:45 a.m., the Roberts emerged from the smokescreen. Chakuma had completed her turn and resumed course toward the carriers. She was now 8,000 yards away, too far for another torpedo run. Copeland ordered Burton to open fire with the forward 5-inch gun. The gun mount rotated toward the target, elevated to maximum range. Fired. The first shell left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. Flight time 12 seconds. The shell landed 400 yards short. Burton adjusted elevation. Fired again. This round landed 200 yards short. Third shot. Splashed near Chakuma's bow. Fourth shot. Hit. The shell struck Chakuma's forward superstructure. Penetrated. Detonated inside. Smoke poured from the impact point. Burton's crew settled into a rhythm. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. 15 rounds per minute. The gun barrel heated. Recoil mechanism cycled. Brass casings piled up inside the mount. After 5 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had expended 75 rounds, 5% of his total ammunition. He had hits on Chakuma. Couldn't tell how much damage. The cruiser was still firing back, still closing on the carriers. At 7:52 a.m., Chakuma shifted her fire from the carriers to the Roberts. 8-inch shells began landing close. Very close. One exploded 30 yards to port. Shrapnel peppered the Roberts' hull. Another landed 20 yards to starboard. Blast wave rocked the ship. A third shell hit the water 10 yards off the bow. The splash drenched the forward gun mount. Seawater poured through the gun ports. Burton's crew kept firing. Water sloshed around their feet. The gun mechanism was designed to work wet. Had to be. Destroyers operated in all weather, all sea states. The crew had trained in simulated flooding. This wasn't simulation. This was combat. And the Japanese were getting their range. At 8:03 a.m., Destroyer Johnston took a hit from battleship Congo. 14-inch shell. Direct impact on her bridge. The explosion killed her executive officer and wounded her captain. Johnston's speed dropped to 17 knots. Steering control shifted to aft steering. The destroyer continued firing. 3 miles to the north, destroyer Howell engaged heavy cruiser Haguro. Howell had already taken multiple hits. Her forward gun mount was destroyed. Number 3 engine room flooded. She was making 15 knots on one engine. The Roberts was still intact, still making 28 knots, still firing at Chakuma, but ammunition was running low. After 18 minutes of continuous fire, Burton had expended 270 rounds from the forward gun, 90% of that mount's ammunition. He had 34 rounds remaining. At the current rate of fire, That gave him 2 minutes and 16 seconds before the forward gun ran dry. At 8:07 a.m., Copeland ordered Burton to shift fire to a new target. Heavy cruiser Tone had closed to 7,000 yards, closer than Chikuma, more dangerous. Tone mounted 8 8-inch guns. She was firing at escort carrier Gambier Bay. Shells were landing near the carrier, getting closer with each salvo. Burton traversed his gun mount to the new bearing, elevated for 7,000 yards, fired. The shell arced toward Tone, landed short, adjusted, fired again, hit. The shell struck Tone's number 2 turret, penetrated the armored face, detonated inside. The turret stopped rotating, stopped firing. Burton had just disabled 1/4 of the cruiser's main battery with a 5-inch gun that wasn't supposed to damage cruisers. At 8:10 a.m., Roberts' forward gun fired its last round. 304 rounds expended. The barrel was scorching hot. Metal glowed dull red. The recoil mechanism was starting to fail. Springs compressed beyond design limits. Oil smoking in the recuperator. Burton's crew had pushed the gun past every specification the Navy had established. Now they were done. The forward mount had no more ammunition. The aft gun mount under gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr still had ammunition. 325 rounds. Carr was 20 years old, from Chakota, Oklahoma. He joined the Navy in May 1942, trained as a gunner at Great Lakes, assigned to the Roberts in April, 6 months ago. This was his first surface action. His gun crew consisted of 10 men, average age 21. They'd been firing continuously since 7:45. 25 minutes, 324 rounds expended, 1 round remaining. At 8:15 a.m., the Roberts' luck ran out. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers had her bracketed, Chikuma to the north, Tone to the northeast, Haguro to the northwest. They were closing. 6,000 yards, 5,000, 4,000. The Roberts was running out of sea room, running out of smoke, running out of time. And she was about to take her first hit. At 8:20 a.m., an 8-inch shell from Chikuma struck the Roberts amidships, port side. The shell penetrated the thin hull plating, traveled through the galley, exited the starboard side without detonating, punched a hole 3 feet wide. Seawater began flooding the lower decks. Damage control teams rushed to seal the breach, stuffed mattresses into the holes, shored up buckled bulkheads. The Roberts took on a 5-degree list to port. 2 minutes later, a second shell hit. This one detonated. The explosion tore through the crew's berthing compartment, killed 6 men instantly. Ruptured steam lines. Superheated steam filled the passageway, scalded 4 more sailors. The Roberts' speed dropped to 24 knots, then 20. 1 boiler was offline. Trowbridge was fighting to keep the other running. At 8:25 a.m., Paul Carr's aft gun mount lost electrical power. The power train that rotated the mount stopped. The hydraulic ram that loaded shells stopped. The firing mechanism went dead. The mount was now manually operated. Carr's crew had trained for this. Every destroyer escort crew trained for combat damage. They knew how to operate the gun without power. It just took longer. Manual operation required muscle. The trainer and pointer hand-cranked the mount to aim at targets. The loader and rammer manually lifted each 54-pound shell, rammed it into the breech by hand. The gun captain manually triggered the firing pin. Rate of fire dropped from 15 rounds per minute to 6, maybe 7 if the crew was fast. Carr's crew was fast. They kept firing. Cranked the mount toward Tone. Loaded a shell, rammed it home, fired. The recoil mechanism absorbed 8 tons of backward force. The mount shook, the deck plates bent. Load another shell. Ram, fire. 6 rounds per minute. The gun barrel was glowing red now. Heat radiated through the mount. Temperature inside reached 130 degrees. The crew was soaking wet. Sweat, seawater from near misses, steam from ruptured lines below decks. At 8:30 a.m., disaster struck the aft mount. A powder charge cooked off. Spontaneous ignition from the overheated breech. The explosion tore through the gun mount. Killed 3 men instantly. Wounded 7 others. Shrapnel shredded the interior. The blast threw Carr backward against the bulkhead. A jagged piece of steel caught him from neck to groin, ripped him open. He fell, landed on the deck. His intestines were exposed. He was dying. But Carr wasn't finished. He looked at the ammunition rack. One shell remained, the last round in the magazine. He crawled toward it, grabbed it. 54 pounds. He couldn't lift it alone, couldn't stand. He held the shell against his chest. Blood poured from the wound. He looked at the breech, looked at his crew. They had to load this shell, had to keep firing. Machinist mate 2nd Class Chalmer Goheen found Carr holding the shell, begging to load it. Goheen took the shell from Carr's hands, tried to help him away from the destroyed gun mount. Carr refused to move. He kept pointing at the breech, kept trying to make Goheen understand. Load the shell. Fire the gun. Keep fighting. Goheen set the shell down, dragged Carr away from the mount. The gun was destroyed. The breech was shattered. The firing mechanism was gone. There was no way to fire that last shell. Carr didn't understand, or maybe he understood and didn't care. He died 5 minutes later, still trying to get back to his gun. At 8:35 a.m., the Roberts took another hit. 14-inch shell, either from Congo or Haruna. Both battleships were firing at the destroyer escort now. The massive shell struck the starboard side, penetrated the number 2 engine room, detonated inside. The explosion tore a hole 40 feet long and 10 feet wide in the hull. Seawater rushed in. The engine room flooded in 30 seconds. 8 men were killed instantly. The Roberts' speed dropped to 10 knots. Then 5, then dead in the water. Copeland ordered all remaining crew topside. The ship was dying. No power, no steering. 3 feet of water in the lower decks. Fires burning in 4 compartments. The Roberts was settling by the stern, going down. At 8:45 a.m., more shells hit. 6-inch rounds from light cruiser Noshiro, 8-inch rounds from Haguro. The Japanese were pounding the helpless destroyer escort. Each hit killed more men, wounded more. The Roberts had become a stationary target. At 9:10 a.m., Copeland gave the order to abandon ship. 115 men were already dead or missing. The remaining 109 sailors began going over the side. They had 3 inflatable life rafts. 2 had been destroyed by shellfire. 1 remained, designed to hold 16 men. They put the wounded in the raft. Everyone else went into the water. 3 floater nets drifted nearby. Men clung to them, held on to anything that floated. Pieces of debris, empty shell casings, wooden planks. At 9:35 a.m., the Roberts rolled to port. Her bow rose out of the water, pointed at the sky. The stern was already underwater. She hung there for 10 seconds, then slipped beneath the surface. Stern first, the bow followed. 306 feet of warship disappeared into the Philippine Sea. She sank in 600 fathoms, 3,600 feet deep, the deepest any American warship had been sunk in combat. 109 men were in the water. Many were wounded, burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones. All were covered in fuel oil, thick black oil from the Roberts' ruptured fuel tanks. The oil coated everything, got in their eyes, their mouths, their lungs. Some men were vomiting, others were unconscious. The water temperature was 84 degrees, warm enough to survive, for a while. They had no food, no fresh water, no rescue in sight. The battle was still raging around them. Japanese warships steamed past. None stopped to pick them up. At 9:45 a.m., Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered the Japanese center force to withdraw. His cruisers had taken heavy damage from the destroyers and aircraft. Chokai was dead in the water. Chikuma was on fire. Suzuya's torpedoes had exploded from a near miss. Kumano's bow had been blown off by a torpedo. 3 heavy cruisers critically damaged. Kurita believed he was fighting fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. His staff kept insisting they were engaging Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet. They were wrong. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were Liberty ship hulls with flight decks. The destroyers were tin cans with 5-inch guns. But the confusion saved the American invasion fleet. The Japanese turned north, headed back toward San Bernardino Strait. The battle off Samar was over. 3 American ships had been sunk. Destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, destroyers Johnston and Howell, escort carrier Gambier Bay had capsized under fire from Yamato's 18-inch guns. 1,277 American sailors were dead or missing, another 1,000 wounded. But the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf survived. MacArthur's troops continued landing. Supplies continued flowing ashore. The Japanese had lost their last chance to stop the Philippine campaign. In the water off Samar, 109 survivors from the Roberts drifted. The battle had moved away, north, then out of sight. Silence settled over the ocean. No engines, no gunfire. Just waves lapping against life jackets. The men clustered around the single life raft and 2 floater nets. The wounded were in the raft. Everyone else held on to the edges, or clung to the nets, or just floated nearby in life jackets. They spread out over a quarter-mile of ocean. Small groups, 2 men, 5 men, 10, trying to stay together, trying not to drift apart. The fuel oil was the worst part. It coated their skin, their hair, their faces. Thick black crude from the Roberts' ruptured fuel tanks. Getting it in your eyes caused temporary blindness, burning, stinging pain. Getting it in your mouth caused vomiting, retching. Some men couldn't stop vomiting. They grew weaker with each hour, dehydrated. The sun rose higher. Temperature climbed above 90 degrees. The men had no shade, no water, no food. The wounded were suffering. Burns were infected within hours in the tropical heat. Open wounds exposed to seawater, to fuel oil, to bacteria. At 2 p.m. on October 25th, sharks arrived. Small ones at first, 6 feet long, black-tipped reef sharks. They circled the survivors, bumped into men, investigating, testing. One sailor removed his oil-soaked clothes to swim easier. Bad decision. The exposed white skin caught a shark's attention. It nudged his leg. Harder. The man panicked, climbed back onto the floater net, cut his hands on the rough rope. Later, larger sharks appeared. 8 feet, 10 feet. Tiger sharks, bull sharks. They came closer, more aggressive, more interested. Survivors couldn't confirm if sharks killed anyone, but 2 men disappeared during the first night, just gone. The others heard splashing, thrashing water, then silence. Nobody wanted to think about what that meant. Night brought cold, relative cold. The water temperature dropped to 78 degrees. Not dangerous, but uncomfortable after 12 hours immersed. Men shivered. Hypothermia set in for the wounded, their core temperatures dropping. 3 more died during the first night. Wounds, shock, exposure. Their bodies were pushed away from the raft, drifted off into darkness, disappeared. October 26th brought more sun, more heat. Dehydration was critical now. Some men were hallucinating, seeing ships that weren't there, seeing land on the horizon, seeing rescue planes. Others were unconscious, lips cracked and bleeding, tongues swollen. 5 more died on the second day. Their bodies joined the others, drifting away into the Philippine Sea. Copeland kept his men together, kept them talking, kept them awake. Falling asleep meant death, meant slipping under the water, drowning. He organized the survivors into groups, assigned leaders, made them count off every hour. Anyone who didn't respond got checked, shaken awake, kept in the group. 14 men died over 3 days, but 95 survived because Copeland refused to let them give up. At 7:45 a.m. on October 27th, a patrol craft spotted the survivors. PC-1119 was escorting 5 landing craft infantry north of Samar. The lookout saw something in the water. Wreckage, bodies, then life jackets. The patrol craft approached cautiously, Japanese survivors were known to play dead, attack rescuers. The PC stopped 50 yards away, called out, asked who won the World Series. An American voice yelled back, "St. Louis Cardinals." The patrol craft moved in. Rescue took 4 hours. 95 men pulled from the water. 50 hours after the Roberts sank. Some couldn't walk, couldn't stand, had to be carried aboard. All were treated for dehydration, burns, wounds, infections, fuel oil poisoning. The most serious cases were transferred to hospital ship Comfort, sailed to Hollandia. The rest went to Leyte, then to San Francisco, aboard transport Lurline. They arrived December 4th, 3 weeks before Christmas. The battle off Samar became known as the greatest last stand in naval history. 7 small ships had turned back 23 warships, saved an entire invasion fleet, prevented a disaster that could have prolonged the Pacific War by months. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it the Navy's finest hour. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote that no engagement in naval history showed more gallantry. The Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Copeland received the Navy Cross. Paul Carr received the Silver Star posthumously. In 1985, the Navy commissioned guided missile frigate USS Carr, named for the gunner, who died holding his last shell. In 1982, frigate USS Copeland was commissioned, named for the captain who led his crew into impossible odds. In June 2022, explorer Victor Vescovo found the Roberts, 22,621 feet down, 4.3 miles. The deepest shipwreck ever discovered, deeper than Titanic. The wreck sits upright, bow separated from stern by impact, but recognizable. The aft gun mount where Carr died is still there, visible in the footage. Silent, waiting. The last survivor, Adrit Lenore, died March 20th, 2022, age 97, 3 months before they found his ship. That's the story of the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, the tiny ship that charged Yamato, the crew that refused to surrender even when survival was impossible. If this story moved you, hit that like button to honor their sacrifice. Subscribe to keep these forgotten heroes remembered. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Do you have family who served in World War II? Share their story below. We read every comment. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. At 9:42 a.m. on July 13th, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen watched General Omar Bradley step out of a jeep near St. Lo, knowing the next 30 seconds would determine whether 3,000 American tanks could break through Normandy's bocage. 29 years old, 2 weeks testing his device, 0 approval. First Army had lost over 400 Shermans in 6 weeks trying to cross Norman hedgerows. The hedgerows weren't hedges. They were earthen walls, 12 feet high and 4 feet thick, reinforced by centuries of root growth. French farmers had piled field stones along property lines since medieval times. Dirt accumulated. Trees grew. When American tanks tried climbing over these ancient barriers, they exposed their 1-inch belly armor. German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns aimed for that spot. Most Sherman crews burned before they could bail out. Cullen's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron from the 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these hedgerows since June 20th. The math was simple and deadly. Every battalion had approximately 70 tanks. Command had allocated 4 M4 dozer tanks with bulldozer blades per battalion. The dozers could push through hedgerows, but they were slow and priority targets for German gunners. Between June 6th and July 10th, American forces had advanced 8 miles inland. Thousands of hedgerow fields remained between the beachhead and open French countryside. At the current rate, First Army would need 6 months to advance 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive, required rapid armored movement through bocage terrain. Nobody had solved the tactical problem. Engineers tried packing explosives into hedgerow bases. The blasts barely dented the earthen walls and attracted German artillery. Some crews welded spare track links to their hulls for extra protection. It helped against machine gun fire, but did nothing against Panzerfausts fired from 10 yards. Other crews attempted ramming hedges at full speed. The Shermans buried themselves nose first into packed earth and roots 500 years old. Cullen had spent 3 days building his solution from German beach obstacles. The obstacles were called Czech hedgehogs, 3 railway iron beams welded into a jack shape. The Germans had planted thousands on invasion beaches to rip landing craft hulls. American engineers cut them apart with torches and stockpiled the steel. Cullen took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, and welded them to a light tank's bow plate. The prongs angled forward 35 degrees. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the steel tusks dug into the base instead of climbing over. The tank pushed through. No belly exposure. He'd tested the device 7 times on a light tank. 7 successful breaches. Then, Major Sidney Bingham from 2nd Armored Division ordered a test on a full-weight Sherman. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, more than double a light tank's 15 tons. Higher impact force meant the prongs might rip off the bowplate, or the tank might flip forward. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered his crew. They welded the 4-prong assembly to Green's Sherman on July 11th. The device weighed 320 pounds. First test run on July 12th worked. 4 more tests worked. The prongs held. Word reached Bradley's headquarters. He ordered a personal demonstration for July 13th. Bradley pointed at a hedgerow 200 yards away, 12 feet high, thick as a fortress wall. The kind that had stopped American armor for 42 days. Green climbed into his commander's hatch. His gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret. The driver started the engine. Cullen stood next to Bradley, watching the Sherman position itself 50 yards from the target hedge. Green's voice came over the radio. Ready to demonstrate hedgerow breach. Bradley raised his binoculars. Proceed. The Sherman accelerated, 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earthen wall with a sound like a freight train collision. Dirt exploded upward. The tank's nose dipped. For 3 seconds, the Sherman pushed against 500 years of compacted earth and root systems. Then the prongs bit through. The hedge collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through the other side in 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap, touched the torn earth, examined the severed roots. Then he turned to Major General Leonard Giroux. How many of these can we produce? Giroux looked at Cullen. The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices. I want 3,000. If you want to see if Cullen's beach trash cutters actually worked in combat, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because what happens next is insane. Back to Cullen. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts. Strike every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Install the cutting device on every Sherman, every light tank, every tank destroyer in First Army. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour. 1 tank every 6 minutes. Cullen had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would break the stalemate or mean absolutely nothing when German anti-tank guns opened fire. Captain James Daugherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Colombier on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He laid out the assembly process on a field table. Cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections. Grind edges to points. Weld to mounting plates. Bolt plates to tank bow. 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. The hedgehog steel was harder than standard construction grade. Cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes and needed cooling time. The first day's production yielded 8 completed devices. 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish modifications sometime in October. Operation Cobra would launch without them. Cullen spent July 15th troubleshooting the production line. The problem was heat buildup in the torch tips. The German steel absorbed thermal energy slower than American steel, causing the cutting equipment to fail. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot and organized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another team's equipment cooled. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15th, still insufficient. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. 3,000 tanks, 38 per day, 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. The welding process revealed another problem. The four-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds. When bolted to a Sherman's bow, the added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The front suspension compressed. After repeated hedgerow impacts, the suspension springs on several test vehicles showed stress fractures. If the springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end. Cullen modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed weight across the hull's structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, but prevented suspension damage. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications. 2,600 tanks remained. Bradley's staff sent a priority message. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans could reinforce their Bocage defenses. Every day of delay cost lives. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation units hauled the obstacles inland on July 20th. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck was welding capacity. Cullen contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. He organized them into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online July 21st. Production jumped to 112 devices per day. The deadline pressure intensified. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. The production site looked like an industrial factory dropped into a Norman field. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra. Production total reached 1,200 devices. Doherty calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Total, 2,050 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum requirement. Then the steel ran out. The Hedgehog stockpiles were exhausted. The Ordnance Group had processed every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers found approximately 300 more Hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits, but transportation was tied up moving ammunition and fuel for Cobra. The obstacles wouldn't arrive in time. Doherty considered alternatives. Railroad tracks could substitute for Hedgehog steel. The tracks were softer than German steel, but available in quantity. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had welded massive railroad tie prongs to several tanks. They called it the Green Dozer. The railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Cullen's design, but they worked. The Ordnance Group shifted to a hybrid production model. Cullen Hedgehog cutters for units with steel remaining. Railroad prongs for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra. The production count reached 1,800 devices. Another 500 were in progress, using railroad steel. Final estimated total, 2,300 Rhino tanks. 77% of Bradley's armor. Not 3,000, not perfect, but enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Cullen walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn, July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft dropping 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Then the armor would advance through the bocage, using Cullen's devices to breach hedgerows the Germans thought were impregnable. Cullen hadn't slept in 72 hours. His hands were covered in burns from hot metal, but he stood in that field watching the tanks assemble and understood something profound. Those steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might survive the bocage breakout. 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death, exposing their tank bellies to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m. The ground near St. Lo shook as 1,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Cullen watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt unnatural. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. 2nd Armored Division led the assault. 3rd Armored Division followed. 1st Infantry Division provided support. Every tank carried Cullen's 4-prong device or the railroad-based variant. Radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m. Company B from the 2nd Armored reached their first hedgerow objective. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour and struck the earthen wall. The prongs dug in. The tank pushed through in 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the device or suspension. More reports followed. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping. The pattern repeated across the entire assault front. Tanks that should have taken hours to advance one field were crossing multiple hedgerows in minutes. The Germans weren't prepared. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over hedgerows, exposing vulnerable belly armor. Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves for upward shots at exposed undersides. Anti-tank guns aimed at predictable climb points. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. That normally took 3 days. 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress. The bocage defensive network was collapsing because the terrain advantage had disappeared. Hedgerows that stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started coming in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact. The tank couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew abandoned the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another failure at 11:20 a.m. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The tank commander reported the device ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it. The tank was combat effective but couldn't breach more hedgerows. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with railroad prongs hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour, too fast. The impact buckled the mounting brackets. The prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. The vehicle was immobilized. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Cobra. 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. Cullen monitored the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive. Tanks advancing faster than any point since D-Day. But those failure reports gnawed at him. 4%. 92 tanks. 460 men. At 1:30 p.m., a report came through that changed everything. A battalion from 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marigny-St. Gilles Road. That was 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were retreating because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage terrain that protected them had become useless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 p.m. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. The defensive stalemate was broken. Cullen left the observation post at 5 p.m. He drove back toward the production site at Colombier. The welding stations were abandoned now. All the tanks had moved forward. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what happened. A sketch on a ration box 3 weeks ago. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows. And now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The failure rate bothered him. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speeds, variables he hadn't tested. 92 crews paying the price for those gaps. But 2,200 devices worked. 14,000 men advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal but clear. 4% failure was better than 60% casualties from exposed belly armor. As the sun set, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The front had moved 8 miles inland. 8 miles in one day. The bocage was behind them now. July 26th. Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedgerow cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering scattered hedge lines in interior France. The devices remained useful. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce another 500 units using remaining railroad steel. By July 28th, the production count reached 2,850 modified tanks. That represented approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles that couldn't mount the devices or units held in reserve. The geographic spread was remarkable. 2nd Armored Division used Rhino tanks from Saint-Lô to Coutances. 3rd Armored Division employed them from Marigny to Avranches. 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortain counterattack. 4th Armored Division received devices on July 30th and used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred heavy railroad prongs. The 2nd Armored Division standardized on Coulin's lighter Hedgehog steel version. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to preserve gun traverse. Light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks. Broken welds could be re-welded in 30 minutes. Completely destroyed devices could be replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available. The production site at Colombier became a repair depot, processing damaged devices and returning them to service. The tactical impact extended beyond hedgerow breaching. German units retreated faster because they couldn't establish defensive positions. Panzer divisions withdrew toward the Seine River. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days. The Falaise pocket formed because German units couldn't escape the encirclement. Rhino tanks blocked retreat routes through bocage terrain. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed their perspective. They called the devices hedge devils or iron tusks. Several prisoners stated they abandoned defensive positions when they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German company commander reported his anti-tank gun crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedges they considered impenetrable. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. American forces had broken through into open French countryside. The hedgerow problem that stopped them for 6 weeks had been solved in 12 days. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. The statistical impact was significant. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped 37% compared to June and early July. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. The 4% device failure rate was negligible compared to the casualty reduction. Not all units kept their devices. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions without dense hedgerows, crews began removing the prongs. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption and top speed on roads. By mid-August, Approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters. Some units retained them. 4th Armored Division kept their devices through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. The 2nd Armored Division stored removed prongs on supply trucks in case they needed reinstallation. Several tank destroyer battalions kept lighter versions permanently mounted. The devices were still in use on September 2nd, when American forces liberated Paris. A few Rhino tanks participated in the Liberation Parade, their steel prongs still visible on the bow plates. French civilians didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew. Those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris. Coulon watched the advance from Normandy. Bradley's staff had reassigned him to training duties, teaching new replacement crews about hedgerow tactics. He spent August demonstrating breach techniques at a training ground near Isigny. On August 15th, a courier delivered a message from Bradley's headquarters. General Bradley wanted to see him. Immediately. No explanation provided.
Cullen drove to headquarters wondering if something had gone wrong. 4% failure rate. 92 trapped tanks. Maybe command wanted explanations. He arrived at 1700 hours and reported to Bradley's office. The general was waiting with several staff officers. Bradley held a folder with official letterhead visible, and Cullen realized this wasn't about failures. Bradley gestured to a chair. Cullen sat. The general opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley, co-signed by Major General Leonard Giroux. "You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley said. "Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Cullen stared at the document. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration. Officers received it for campaign-level contributions. Sergeants almost never qualified. "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks." "You solved a tactical problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The device is officially designated the Cullen Hedgerow Cutting Device in Army records. You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20th at a field near Saint-Lô. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullen's uniform. Approximately 200 officers and enlisted men attended. Several tank commanders whose crews used the devices were present. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. He'd breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without losing a single crew member. The citation read at the ceremony credited Cullen with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a device that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and facilitated the Allied advance through Normandy. It mentioned the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction. News of the award reached other Allied armies. British tank units requested technical specifications for the device. The British Army's 21st Army Group produced approximately 300 similar designs, though they called them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian armored divisions manufactured 200 devices using salvaged German steel from their own beach sectors. The Soviet Union received technical drawings through Lend-Lease channels, but never adopted the design. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized overwhelming force rather than terrain adaptation. They solved bocage-type problems by concentrating artillery fire until obstacles ceased to exist. The Coulon device appeared in training manuals by September. The Army's Armored Force School at Fort Knox added hedgerow breaching techniques to its curriculum. New tank crews learned the tactical doctrine: approach at 25 miles per hour, strike the hedge base, maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds, clear the opposite side, continue advance. Field modifications continued through autumn 1944. Some crews added steel teeth to the prongs for better earth penetration. Others welded angled deflector plates to prevent the prongs from catching on buried obstacles. A few innovative crews created folding versions that could be retracted when not needed. The devices saw limited use after Normandy. The terrain beyond the bocage didn't require specialized breaching equipment. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. The few hedgerow encounters in Belgium and Germany were handled with standard dozers or infantry explosives, but the tactical lesson remained. Field improvisation using available materials could solve problems that stopped entire armies. Senior officers began encouraging similar innovation. When American forces encountered Dragon's Teeth anti-tank barriers in Germany, engineers developed improvised ramps from rubble and steel beams. The precedent came from Coulin's beach obstacle solution. Coulin returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25th. His unit was advancing through northern France toward Belgium. He resumed duties as a cavalry sergeant. No special treatment. No headquarters assignment. Just regular reconnaissance work. He participated in combat operations through September and October. His unit crossed into Germany in November. The war continued. The Rhino tanks were largely forgotten by then. New problems required new solutions. The Bocage was 600 miles behind the front lines. The 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River in April 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Cullen had served 3 years in combat. He was 30 years old. The war was over. He returned to the United States in June 1945 and received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed in his service record. So was his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But civilian life didn't care about wartime innovations. He needed a job. What happened to Cullen after he returned home would determine whether his contribution disappeared into history or became something remembered. Cullen returned to Cranford, New Jersey in July 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They moved to New York City, where he found work with Shenley Industries, a spirits company. The job had nothing to do with tanks or military engineering, just regular employment for a man trying to rebuild civilian life. The hedgerow cutter story followed him. Local newspapers ran articles about the Cranford sergeant who invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature on September 7, 1944, while Cullen was still in France. The article described how he showed his plans to his captains and how General Bradley called it revolutionary. But national recognition was limited. The war continued through 1945. Other innovations and battles dominated news coverage. The atomic bomb, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. A tank modification from July 1944 became historical footnote material. General Bradley changed that. He published his memoirs, A Soldier Story, in 1951. The book included detailed descriptions of the Bocage problem and Cullen's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Cullen by name and described watching the demonstration on July 13th. The memoir brought renewed attention. Military historians began citing the Cullen device as an example of field innovation solving strategic problems. The Army's official history of the European theater, published in 1953, dedicated several paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their impact on Operation Cobra. But Cullen himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He worked at Shenley Industries through the 1950s. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage through Colonel Curtis Grubb. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews, no speaking engagements, just a regular life. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had lasting impact. The Army revised field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions using available materials. Training programs taught officers to encourage enlisted innovations rather than waiting for official equipment. The concept that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became institutionalized. NATO forces adopted similar approaches. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own field modification protocols. The Soviet Union, despite rejecting the hedgerow cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The precedent set in Normandy influenced Cold War military doctrine. The actual devices mostly disappeared. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox displayed a Sherman with original hedgerow prongs.
The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example, but most of the 2,850 devices were scrapped or lost. The engineering principles survived. Modern combat engineers study the Coulin device as a case study in rapid field adaptation. The concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations appears in current military training. Army engineers in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing counter-IED equipment. Curtis Coulin died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary and local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But the notice was brief. Few people outside military history remembered the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened. President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite asked about the bocage problem. Eisenhower told the story of the hedgerow cutter. He described Coulin by name. He explained how the device changed the campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964. Millions of Americans watched. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied commander, transformed the hedgerow cutter from footnote to legend. Coulin wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the recognition it deserved. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy hedgerow country. Eisenhower stood in a field near St. Lo, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration occurred. The hedgerows were still there. 20 years later, still 12 feet high, still formidable obstacles. And Eisenhower explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled an entire army. The official recognition began before Operation Cobra finished. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TB-ORD 231. The bulletin officially designated the device as Hedgerow Cutting Device M1 Cullen Type. It included installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. The designation meant the improvised modification had become standard Army equipment. Supply depots stocked replacement prongs. Maintenance units carried welding specifications. Training manuals incorporated breach techniques. A field invention created in 3 days had entered official military doctrine in 3 weeks. 3rd Army adopted the device when it became operational on August 1st. General George Patton's forces received approximately 500 cutters for their advance across France. Patton's after-action reports credited the devices with enabling rapid movement through scattered bocage terrain in Brittany and eastern France. 9th Army received technical specifications in September when it deployed to Europe. They manufactured approximately 200 devices using salvaged German steel from fortifications. The production happened at forward depots rather than Normandy beaches, proving the concept could be replicated anywhere steel and welding equipment existed. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical assistance on August 5th. British engineers visited the Columbier's production site and studied the design. They created their own variant called the Prong Device Mark I. Canadian forces developed similar equipment designated Obstacle Cutter Improvised Type A. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued a commendation for innovative field engineering on August 15th. The commendation cited the hedgerow cutter as an example of enlisted initiative solving operational problems. SHAEF distributed the citation to all Allied armies in Europe. It emphasized that tactical solutions could originate from any rank. The statistical analysis completed in September quantified the impact. 1st Army's Operational Research Section compared casualty rates before and after Rhino deployment. Tank losses dropped from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties decreased 37%. Time required to advance through bocage terrain decreased by 73%. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency. Each hedgerow cutter cost approximately $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra. That represented $18.9 million in preserved equipment, not counting the value of trained crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the device in October 1944. Their report recommended incorporating hedgerow breach training into basic tank crew qualification. The recommendation was implemented in November. Every American tank crew trained after that date learned Coulin's techniques. Field Manual FM 1733, the Armored Battalion, received an update in December 1944. The update included a full chapter on obstacle breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams showed proper prong installation. Tactical sections explained breach procedures. Maintenance sections covered field repairs. The doctrine spread beyond armored forces. Combat engineer training incorporated the concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials. Infantry officers learned to identify suitable breach points for supporting armor. Artillery forward observers studied how to coordinate fires during hedgerow breaching operations. The long-term effect extended into Cold War doctrine.
NATO forces, developing plans for potential combat in Central Europe, studied the Bocage campaign extensively. Warsaw Pact defensive doctrine anticipated NATO forces using similar improvised breaching equipment. Soviet military publications from the 1950s referenced the Cullen device as an example of capitalist military flexibility. The U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute used the hedgerow cutter as a teaching case from 1953 onward. Officer candidates at West Point analyzed the decision-making process that led to the device's adoption. Enlisted leadership courses taught that tactical problems could be solved at any rank with proper initiative. By 1960, the hedgerow cutter appeared in 16 different military training curricula across NATO armies. The total number of soldiers who studied the innovation exceeded 50,000. The concept that one sergeant's sketch could change a campaign became institutionalized military knowledge. But Curtis Cullen never taught those classes, never gave those lectures, never saw the doctrine manuals that bore his name. He worked at Schenley Industries, lived quietly in New York, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower's television interview made him a household name. The question became whether his contribution would be remembered beyond military circles or fade into the obscurity that claims most wartime innovations. The modern legacy of Curtis Cullen's invention exists in three places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman with original Cullen-type hedgerow cutters. The placard explains the bocage problem and how a sergeant from New Jersey solved it with German beach obstacle steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors see the exhibit annually. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Their exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Columbiers and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays let visitors understand the engineering principles behind the prongs. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a small section dedicated to American field innovations. They display actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near St. Lo. French visitors often don't recognize their significance. American veterans do. But the most important legacy isn't in museums, it's in doctrine. Every modern military force teaches the principle Cullen demonstrated. Strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage. That lesson influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 80 years. The hedgerow cutter principle appeared in Iraq, when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection. It appeared in Afghanistan, when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles using field-fabricated parts. It appears whenever soldiers face unexpected tactical problems and create solutions without waiting for official equipment. Curtis Cullen's grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his military service and his Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most people walking through that cemetery don't know who he was or what he did. But 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children.
The number of people alive today because Curtis Cullen welded beach trash to a tank in July 1944 is incalculable. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. He never knew that. He died thinking his contribution was a footnote. He worked a regular job, lived a quiet life, never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews. Just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem and fixed it. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019. His obituary mentions serving alongside Curtis Cullen. The veteran remembered watching the first hedgerow breach. He said it was the moment he knew they'd survive Normandy. That's the real legacy. Not the medals, not the museum displays, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives. 1,500 men who didn't burn to death in Sherman tanks. 1,500 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back. And it started with a sergeant staring at scrap steel on a Norman beach, imagining what those German obstacles could become if you welded them to American tanks. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every week. Stories about sergeants and mechanics and ordinary soldiers who saved lives with scrap steel and courage and 15 seconds of genius. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Curtis Cullen doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.